Roll call. We've got our roll call, and then you want to walk us through the agenda?
Yep. Yep, I'm happy. You want to take care of the roll call?
Oh, sure. Yes. Dave, you want to start us off?
Sure. Dave Bugney attending in person.
Casey Kula attending in person.
Julie Furman in person. Wendy Gerlach in person.
David Showalter in person. Jacob Wise in person.
Adam Noble in person.
Will Tucker in person.
Josh Seeds in person.
Seth Barnes, person.
Casey Detweiler in person. And then folks on the phone.
Jason Robinson on virtual.
And
Megan
this is,
Franco? No, go ahead, Terry.
yeah, I was gonna say, this is Terry Free. I'm virtual, and I also wanted to introduce Megan Cogswell. She's the new adaptive management program training and enforcement manager. And I'll let you say a word or two, a few sentences to introduce folks to yourself.
Hi, everybody, nice to meet you. I'm sorry to be virtual. We're down at a training in Canyonville, and it's my second week, and I come from Chemeketa Community College with a long ago background in forestry. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to meeting you all in person next time.
Thanks.
Anyone else virtual?
This is Jeff Young with No Fisheries.
Great, welcome, Jeff. All right, I think we're all here. Terry, do you want to walk us through the agenda quickly and then go to public comment? Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. So we just did the roll call, we've got some updates, public comment here in a moment. I also realized something not on here is approving the meeting summary. So it's not meeting minutes, it's meeting summary from April. Then we've got somebody from DOJ to talk about public meetings and records. We'll talk about research topics, including some conversation with a couple of the authors of the Private Forest Accord, looking at the AMC, approve the AMC charter is the plan, and then wrapping up. So that's it for the agenda. Let me go on the next slide, and I'll do housekeeping real quick. So just a reminder, these are open public meetings. They're recorded and they're available online. Side conversations, especially in the room, make it harder for those of us outside attending virtually to hear it, and also makes it harder on the recording. So please stick to one person talking at a time. Online, please mute when you're not speaking. And I think you folks know where the restrooms and exits are there. They're just sort of around the corner past the main desk. And then I think before we go to public comment, probably good, Stacy, if you could tackle the meeting summary from the April meeting. This is the first one we've done. So any folks have any thoughts about that?
I guess I'll just open it up. Any thoughts on meeting summary process, feedback?
You might need a minute to read it. Have people had a chance to read it already?
I just skimmed it, but that's a good idea.
I'll read.
Sure. Oh, yeah, please. And Terry, I would note for the record that Amanda Sullivan Astor from AOL is here now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Does Megan Tuttle get a also here?
Active public.
Yeah, exactly.
And somehow on the screen, on my screen at least, it's coming up black. I can still read it just fine, but just okay, that's a little easier to read.
Terry, sorry, I didn't realize we were gonna go through this. So just process-wise, this will be, you'll put this together and share it out at the meeting or in advance of the meeting, or?
In advance, I think I thought I sent it to you folks 2 or 3 weeks ago. Maybe, am I incorrect about that?
If you did, I didn't look at it. So that's-
Okay,
That you did, and that's also fine. Yeah.
Maybe, because I know I pulled the documents for this meeting, maybe just including the meeting notes in the meeting materials. Just
copy.
develop that list.
Yeah, it'll be redundant, but that makes sense. Give it to you before and the day of. Perfect, okay.
Other thoughts?
This is helpful. Thank you for putting it together.
I think it's a really nice level of detail and content's great. I have one suggestion, which is maybe after you note that motion number 3 rescinds the second motion, it might be kind of useful just to state conclusion, motion, the motion number 1 is the deciding motion and who is.
Yeah, that
fixing
makes
it.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Other thoughts, comments on the summary?
I think it's a good level of detail. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Terry, for putting that together.
Do we
Yeah.
want to, is there any sort of need to vote to, I mean, I know with meeting minutes, usually you do. I know meeting summary, I know this isn't I'm not officially calling for a substantial decision. I'm just asking the group. I mean, is it good enough to like get a thumbs up from everybody? This looks pretty good, or what would you propose, Terry? Others that have thoughts?
Yeah, I'll let others speak first.
I'm fine with them. Sir, you know, no, it's an objection.
This is Casey. I think that maybe a way to do it is if there's something that you're like, boy, I don't recall that being the way that it was, that be something that's raised. At the time, right, of, oh yeah, this looks good.
Any objections, we go forward.
Yeah.
I support Wendy's idea of that minor clarification.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Okay, David, are you able to make that
Sure,
change on the
yeah,
fly?
took me a minute there. Sorry, this is reading.
Gotcha.
Terry, does that process make sense, or did you have other suggestions?
No, I think it makes sense to, you don't need necessarily a formal roll call, but just a thumbs up, people good with this type of approval.
The objections, generally okay with meeting summary as shared with us? Okay, seeing head nods.
Okay. Okay. So,
Real quick, Terry, so our charter does say that, at least the proposed charter, for each meeting, the ODF staff shall develop an executive summary of the discussions. The AMC shall consider approving the executive summary at the subsequent meeting. And so it does sound a little bit more than just a head nod. It might be, and I hate to say it, but it might need to be a motion to accept it as now amended. Just because.
yeah, I think the charter is sort of unclear because it's not, doesn't say it shall be a substantial decision. It says an approval, and
Yeah, and so I
it's
don't
up to
know
you if
what
it's a
the,
substantial decision.
yeah, the question is, what is it? And I don't really care. I like the summary though, because when we have the official meeting minutes being an audio file, you have to go find, listen through and look at. It's much easier for me to have a folder, a tab that says minutes, and I can thumb and find that. And so I like it, but I just want to make sure that we looked at what we're supposed to follow.
Amanda?
I would propose to the group that given the language of approval in the draft charter, I think as long as we kind of give a head nod, a thumbs up, and then that is notated in the next executive summary that, the group approved it, I think that that would meet the charter without having to do a formal motion, as long as it's just kind of notated in the next one.
Concerns with Amanda's suggestion?
None.
Okay,
No.
great.
And to that end, perhaps, one other suggestion I might make is that at the beginning of this, say, you know, this was the first one, so there was no executive or a meeting summary to approve at this meeting. So, I don't know, maybe something to that end.
Okay.
Or maybe just like an asterisk at the bottom. I don't know.
This is the first one.
Yeah, so if somebody looked at this like, oh, and then saw new ones, like, oh, was there no, like, am I missing something?
Okay, so just to summarize, moving forward, Terry, you'll share out the meeting notes and then the prep in the next meeting's materials, include the notes, and then we will all review them and be prepared to kind of give a head nod, yes, and speak up if you've got concerns or objections with the notes as prepared by Terry. Sound good? All right.
Correction in my last name, Robinson, so remove the N.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, thanks. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. That's helpful. If we could go on to the next slide, which is public comment. Is there any public comment today?
Eric Keish might be there.
Uh-oh, we're getting noticed.
You can hit the up arrow.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry. Okay.
Getting there.
I'll stop looking. Maybe
So,
summarize it. Watching the cursor.
so let's just take, is there any public comment today? I'm hearing crickets, so move on to the next one. Some quick updates. We've got a contract with INR. We're working through the details to get them up and running to support IRST. There's the spring, what we call the spring cleanup for all the rules. That's going to the board on June 7th. It's mostly cleanup, small corrections, whatnot. One change that does affect you folks is that the AMC interim members, it's can serve up to 1 year instead of just 90 days. So that's an official change that we made to better align with the nomination, the annual board nomination process. So just so you're up to date with that. And then there's a possibility of doing a field trip as the AMC on June 26th. And I'm just putting that out so folks can think about that. We're considering this, think 2 to 3 hours in the field with a little bit of time in a district office beforehand. We'll talk about this more later. I just want to put it on people's radar, but we'll talk about it later today. I mean, we'll need to get through some other work first. So any question about the updates before we move on?
That's 2026. Yeah.
So there's a lot of people talking. It's hard to hear online.
2026 for the year.
Oh, gotcha. 2023 typo.
He should find ahead.
Okay, I'm the old one here.
I hope not.
Yeah, just to clarify, we're brainstorming a little bit about the next meeting, having a field component and getting outside. We'll probably talk, we'll talk about it in more detail related to the research topics, but putting that on your radar for your availability.
Yep.
Anything else on that, Terry?
Nope. I think you said it pretty good. So participation grants. Please email me by the close of business on June 9th. Let me know if you're opting in or opting out. And we need this information as we put together a budget for money that we are planning on the legislature budgeting for us. And the grants are $1,000 per month per organization, just so people understand the number we're talking about. So I'll send out a follow-up email reminding people about that, but if you could make a note to let me know whether you're opting in or opting out for the June 9th. Any questions there?
Not seeing any in the room.
Okay, great. So let's do lunch. Let's come back at, let's see here. Can you all make the 1:35 or I'm sorry, 12:35 for, does that work for folks?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Could be eating.
Yeah.
It's true.
Legacy.
Recording. Okay. Folks ready to get rolling again here?
Good.
Okay. So today we've got Matt DeVore from the Oregon Department of Justice to talk about public records and public meetings. And he's the expert at this. So I'm going to turn the table over to him and let him, and I guess maybe Matt, if you could also just share a little bit about that there will be time for Q&A after your part. So I'll let you take it from there, Matt. Thank you. Oh, and if you could actually stop sharing the PowerPoint so it'll be easier to see people, that would be great. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Terry. My name's Matt DeVore. I work for the Oregon Department of Justice. Happy to be here this afternoon. Happy to be a part of the new city as you're all getting started. I don't know a lot about you all as committee members, so if some of you have a lot of experience with public records and public meetings, this is going to be kind of maybe a boring overview, but hopefully I'll be able to get into a couple of specific questions that Terry said might be coming up that you had questions about and talk through some of those issues. As far as background, I have my notes here and I'm going to go through to try to make sure I cover all the points, but if you have any questions or want to stop me along the way, please feel free. Just as general background, the Department of Justice provides general counsel advice to the Department of Forestry and any of the committees or subcommittees or task forces that the Department of Forestry assists. There are two contact counsels in our section, our natural resources section, myself and Annika Marriott. Annika handles state forest and Endangered Species Act issues. My focus is more on the forest resources and the fire protection side of things. So Private Forest Accord and Forest Practices Act is where I have spent a lot of time. We provide general counsel legal advice on a wide range of topics to state agencies. And Department of Justice has, just talking about, the Department of Justice has a wide range of attorneys that cover different topics. And if we in general counsel can't find the answers for you, we usually can connect you with people that can. Some of the other sections and divisions in Department of Justice are the civil enforcement section that handles the litigation work where the plaintiff is the state. A lot of that work is on cost recovery for fire protection, recovering ODF's fire protection costs. We also have a business transaction section who handles all of our contract work, or the majority of our contract work. Labor and employment handles labor issues. And then we have trial and appellate attorneys that also handle issues where the state is the defendant in litigation or when there's any appeals. advice from DOJ to state agencies is generally protected by the attorney-client privilege. Since we're here in a public meeting, that privilege isn't going to apply here. If that was an avenue that you wanted to pursue, we can look at doing written memos that are confidential and protected by attorney-client privilege. Or you could go into an executive session where it's just the committee, ODF staff, and your attorneys, where we can get into a little bit more of the confidentiality. But for purposes of today, since it is a public meeting, don't have that attorney-client privilege, and my comments would be a little bit more general here than they would be in a confidential setting. Another important point that I want to raise for the benefit of the agency and the folks that are in charge of the budgets, DOJ bills its time to state agencies at an hourly rate. We kind of operate like a contractor, not an in-house counsel. So when Terry or others at ODF request DOJ advice, it comes with a cost, and that has to be built into the budget. So while I'm happy to be here and happy to provide help as any questions come up, it's important to keep in mind that those are costs to the agency that have to be built in the budget. So with that background, Terry asked me to address a couple of questions about public meetings law and public records law. And I really do hope that this will be a dialogue. I don't want to just talk at you for however much time we have together. I want this to be helpful and informative. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to stop me and ask. So with that, I'll start with the public records law. The Oregon Public Records Law is in statute under ORS 192.311 through 478. It's a law that encourages government transparency and disclosure of records. It provides that every person has a right to inspect public records, so long as they're not exempt from disclosure. But one of the first questions that we would want to address is what records are subject to the public records law. And for the purposes of these statutes, the legislature defined public record to include any writing that contains information relating to the conduct of the public's business that is prepared, owned, used, or retained by that public body, regardless of the physical format or characteristics. The definition also includes a statement that a public record does not include writings that do not relate to the public's business and are stored on a privately owned computer. That's the broad statutory definition. And the way that this often comes up for state agencies is when we receive a public records request. Somebody wants to see what the public records are. Any individual can make a public records request, and agencies have specific timelines that they have to follow when responding to those requests. The response either says, we have the requested records and we will produce them, or it explains why the records can't be produced if an exception applies. And then if an individual is not satisfied with the agency's response, they can file a petition with the Attorney General for a public records order. Then the agency would generally comply with, but if not, or if the person is still dissatisfied with the Attorney General order, they can petition to circuit court.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, please.
Can you expand a little bit on sort of the public's business, like what falls in that sphere as it relates, to our work on this committee about adaptive management, maybe compared to our work based on our nonprofit or agency or organization?
Yeah. Yep, I think that was one of the questions that Terry,
Okay.
yeah, exactly was.
I think I asked Terry like 4 times in different ways.
Yeah, well, and hopefully I'll be able to get to that, but it is certainly a gray area. If you're dealing with, and my experiences with Forest Practices Act enforcement. So I think a lot of what you're going to be doing is coming up with forest practices and different alternatives or updates to the forest practices. And if that's what you're doing in your personal or your business affairs, it gets hard to separate that out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll hit to that. But if not, let's keep talking about it. Yeah, so the question that Terry asked me, as I've summarized it, is what's the line between a committee member's personal communications that are exempt from the public meetings law from a committee member's AMC communications that are covered by the public law? Is that a fair way to look at it? So yes, the way that the definition is set up is that records that are related to the conduct of the AMC are going to be public record. If it doesn't relate to the conduct of the AMC and it's, or if it does relate to the conduct of the AMC and it's retained by ODF or even members of the committee, then it's a public record and subject to disclosure. If the record is on a state or ODF server, like an email server, it's really easy to address public records requests because we can just search those servers and email accounts and find the records that are relevant. But it gets more difficult when it's on a committee member's personal device or work device. Even if they're stored on the private devices, it generally would be subject to the public records law. And we've had some situations in the last few years where with the Board of Forestry, board members using personal email accounts and a public record request comes in or a discovery request comes in through litigation. And we have to go out to the board members and say, we need you to pull all of your personal or business emails on this particular topic. And it's not real comfortable for any of us to do because it's asking volunteer board members like yourselves to go through your personal or work email servers and separate out what may be personal information from information that is a public record. So our advice to ODF and our advice to the committee is that you all be issued a state email address and that we would encourage you to use your state email address for any AMC business. What that would mean is emails to and from this account would be your official way of communicating about AMC business. The emails would be saved on a state server so that it would be easy for us to access if there was a public records request. You should provide this email address to any stakeholders who are trying to communicate with you about AMC business and avoid using your personal or business accounts for conduct related to the AMC. And the risks, if you don't do this, what we're trying to protect against is that we don't want to have to ask you to go into your private servers or your private emails and respond to a petition for public records or a subpoena. The other risk is that if you inadvertently delete something that is a public record and it's on your private email account, it could be a violation of the state's record retention laws. Their state servers are set up to protect against that. And we also have a level of security with state servers to make sure that you don't inadvertently allow somebody to hack into your system and release confidential or privileged records. So those are the risks we're trying to protect against. We want to keep you all out of trouble and avoid litigation. So for the purposes of this topic, my main suggestion is to strongly encourage you all to use an ODF email account and avoid storing any public records on private servers. If you have a need for a computer or a phone or something to do AMC business, I would encourage you to talk to Terry about getting state issued devices for storing that information rather than using your own phones or laptops.
So Matt, do you want to be interrupted along the way or?
Sure.
Okay, so I represent the Association of Oregon Counties. As an elected county commissioner, I have been giving updates about discussions here at AOC type meetings. My concern is that I would envision there might be questions down the road where I may want to question out to my peers that I'm supposed to be representing to make sure that my thinking's aligned with where we're going, is consistent with where input needs to be gathered that's different than my perspective. I can imagine a dozen different ways where I might want to communicate with my fellow electeds. All of our stuff is, I'm used just their county email, so it's all pretty well secured, but you worry me some, not worry, but you cause me pause, I guess would be the proper word. I think about attempting to do that and wanting to try and do that only through a state email, because the people are used to my .us email that's the county, and that's the current mode. And that's currently where most people go at me when I do get public records requests against me, or there's issues before us and we're being looked at for something, or the state's responding to our lawsuit, and you wanted me to go through my emails to see what my attorney-client stuff that's not privileged might say, or what might be reaching out to others. So I just worry some about my ability to function as a representative of my fellow electeds. And I'm not worried about the content. I'm just worried about the idea of trying to make sure that I'm always in the state email system when I'm used to being in the county email system, knowing that that's my rule there. My phone has never been taken yet, but there have been times they've talked about taking my phone for a few days to go through all of my deleted emails and all those things that are still record there. Not too distant past lawsuit. So I run this risk, but I'm not sure I want to run it by trying to run another whole email account that I might not watch enough. If you don't understand. The only time I look at the Elect Will Tucker campaign email is what at the end of, to make sure the Secretary of State's correspondences are all responded to close the election thing. But I don't look at that account. And I would think with an AMC one, but I worry. I already have a home email that I put all my coupons and silly. Man, it's crazy this world we're coming to of all this stuff. But I'm just a little worried about the practicality for myself, and I'm probably just because of my age, the ancient one. But as the ancient one, I am worried that I will be writing out of the easiest email, and I take it with me wherever I go. It's pretty much glued to me. And now having to come up with a separate potential computer to carry with me worries me some. What is the risk if I say, Niet, I want you to write to me at my county email. That's the one that travels with me everywhere I go in the world. It is the email I want and prefer. What is that risk, and how does the organization feel, and how does the team feel about that? Because I personally don't mind. I've had more than one, probably at least once or twice a year, someone requests on certain topics, and they do keyword searches and they pull all out hundreds of emails, and it happens. So it causes me pause.
Sure. And the email address you would use is the county email address.
Yep.
Stored on a county server.
Yep.
Subject to the public records law.
Yep.
So it's going to be a little bit different from somebody that has a Gmail account that they use for their work or old email account where it's a private entity. If your county email is going to be subject to the public records law, then you may be comfortable with that risk, and your county council may be comfortable with that risk.
County council, they're never comfortable with anything.
Sure. I'm going to have a similar position where I'm going to say, for the state, this is going to be much less risky if it's on a state server. If you've got it on a county server that is a public record that is used to responding to public records requests, then I would say that the importance of a state issued email address for you is probably much lower.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, I think just to follow up, when we get a public records request, if it is asking for AMP-C records, we're going to come to you and say, do you have any AMP-C records on your personal server, or not your personal, but your county servers, your county email addresses? And it's going to put some of the obligation on you and the county to then search through your servers. And that's, it's an added burden. It's an added step, but it's your decision. And if you're comfortable with that, then we can comply with the public records law.
Follow up on your question though. I was a county commissioner in Yamhill County until fairly recently. So my county council would ask this of you, which is how is his county council going to recoup the cost when you come to him with a public records request? Just like DOJ is not covering it.
Right. No, the public records law does allow us to recover the actual costs of searching and filing the records. So when we say, when an ODF says, all right, we've got a public records request, it would put together a cost estimate and the requester would generally have to pay that cost estimate before the records are provided. There are waivers available and some agencies are going to be more lenient in whether to allow a waiver. But generally, the requester does have some obligation to pay the costs.
Right, so you'll just send it, that request in and you will send the request on, and county council will put together the cost estimate that you will forward on to the requester.
And I won't say I would do that.
Oh, yeah.
But that would be my advice to the AMC or to ODF, that this is an option available to recover those costs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking that one.
And cost recovery is hard because sometimes they can get really expensive. And if somebody is asking for a newspaper, they've got a lot of really good public interest reasons that they shouldn't have to pay those costs. So there's a balancing.
Yeah, and we play that rule by saying if it's the newspaper and it's within the last 60 days, we charge nothing.
Yeah.
It's when it's been deleted and we're having to go back into our archives to pull things. That's when we start to charge, even the press.
Yeah, even the press. And if it's somebody that wants to pull records because they want to file private litigation, their personal benefit, then it's easier to say, yes, we're going to charge for those things.
I build on your question and ask if you're not using a county email or a county server and it's private one or a nonprofit one or business, what are the risks in that situation? Can you step us through that?
Yeah, so the big one is that if you have it on your private servers and we get in a public records request or a subpoena, if we're in litigation, because it's under your control as an AMC member, it's still going to be subject to state custody, right? You as a AMC member have custody or control. I think the risk is that it would be considered under state custody or control, and there's an obligation for the AMC or for ODF to release it. So we would need you then to search through your servers. If I don't know how far a court or a requester would push, but if you say, here are the 5 documents, and they think there's 10, and how hard are they going to push to get those other 5? Worst case scenario, I'm going to be most cautious, and I'm going to be concerned that a judge could say, bring me your phone, bring me your computer, and we're going to search through it and check. And then everything, your personal and business, is all of a sudden in a courtroom somewhere. That's kind of worst case scenario. I haven't seen it happen, but
It's helpful to know what the risks we're looking at it.
yeah.
Others who haven't asked a question? Oh, sorry. Wendy and Bert.
I'm trying to go back to the definition of what would be a covered email, and your definition was quite broad. So it sounded to me like, because we're on this committee, any communication we make to anyone in the world about this committee could be subject to request. Is that true?
Subject to a request. The request could, well, it would have to be related to the conduct of the committee. So Terry asked a couple of questions that I will try to, they might help to give us some examples here. So one of them is committee members discussing with colleagues work practices as applied to their personal business, but not a part of an AMC review. This probably wouldn't be covered under the public records law because it's not something on the AMC agenda. And then Terry asked, well, what about something that isn't currently on the AMC agenda, but may be in a few years from now, something that the AMC wants to talk about. And I think the risk there is still pretty low because it's not currently before the AMC, it's not the affairs of the AMC, even though it may someday become the affairs of the AMC. Yeah, so one of the ways that I put this was to say if it's on the AMC agenda or the work plan, and you're getting input from colleagues on something that's really on your work plan right now, or you're sending an email to stakeholders to say what you think about a topic that's on our work plan right now. Yeah, those are things that you probably should be using a state email account for, or expecting that they're going to be AMC business. But if it's a forest practice rule that you're discussing with colleagues, but it's not necessarily something currently on the agenda, then I think the risk is pretty small.
Doesn't it kind of impact whether we're acting in our position as being on this committee? I mean, is that a relevant point that I'm making? It
Yes.
seems to me we could be, because we all have like other gigs, so to speak. And so we aren't always acting in our capacity as members of this committee.
If can you give me a little bit more concrete example?
Yeah, we like, we could be in our regular jobs discussing issues that have to do with AMPC topics. Like I could be working on drafting a conservation easement with a legal client of mine, and we could be talking about riparian buffers on a conservation easement and how they have changed under the private forest accord, and the fact that some of these issues might change and that the adaptive management program committee relates to that work.
If you're not currently looking at the riparian rules or how to improve those riparian rules, I don't think it would be AMC business. If you're just trying to, or even let's say that it is on the agenda that you're looking at revising the riparian rules, but in your private business, you are looking at how to apply the current rules as they are. I think we'd have a good argument to say that's separate and different. If it's not looking at how the AMC should be updating or researching.
But I think from what you're saying, it sounds to me like it doesn't really have to do with whether I am acting in capacity of AMPC member. Like by example, I was just acting as a lawyer for a client.
If you're advising on the way the law is currently written, then I would say it's not. But if you're getting input about how the AMC should be updating the rule or research the AMC should be doing to update the rule, that would be more related to what the AMC's business is. It's tough because
I'll let other people ask questions. I feel a kind of gray area here.
Yeah,
I'll think of that.
definitely, there is great.
Yeah, I have a question after Seth.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, she asked my question. That was the exact area I was gonna, so. Go ahead.
So thinking about like an example, right, where you can actually respond. So for a lot of us, we work for an association or a nonprofit, and we got put on this committee to act on behalf of that organization. So yes, we are individuals, right? But we're acting on behalf of an organization. And so we are charged with going and giving reports and getting advice and acting on behalf of that organization, not on behalf of our individual self. So to that extent, you know, when I go to a executive committee meeting for my organization and I'm giving a report on the business of this group and getting advice, of which I am supposed to be doing, would my executive committee report be subject to a to a records request? And then in that case, I'm assuming that we could redact everything that doesn't matter to the topic that was requested. But just again, trying to better understand which pieces of, you know, what documents that I'm creating to be the best committee member I can be would be subject.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that the public records law only applies to records. Records is broadly defined to include recordings. If there's a recording of it, you know, that would be subject. It doesn't apply to conversations. So the meeting itself wouldn't necessarily implicate the public records law. But if you had an executive report or something that was written that came out of this, then we'd have concerns. And what I would say is that if you're in the executive committee session, you're talking about whatever topics are relevant, that's not going to be AMP-C business. But if you get to a point where they're saying, all right, here's what we want you to convey to AMP-C, or here's the business we want you to take with the AMP-C. I think the safest course would be to say, all right, let's get that in a document that is to me as an AMP-C member. And it's not to me as a executive on AOL, but it's to me as an AMP-C member. You can still participate in the discussion, still be an active part of the executive committee. But when they start putting things in writing that they want you to bring back to the AMP-C, that's where I would say a line could be drawn.
Like the deliberations towards the decision.
The deliberations could occur privately, or even, orally probably. But then if there's written recommendations, those will be made to you as an AMC. Kind of like putting on, which hat are you wearing? Are you there to be a part of the executive committee, or are you there to be an AMC representative?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to separate the two because it's my job.
Yeah. That's,
I mean, I'm on like 10 committees for ODF, so how do you juggle all of that?
Yeah, if it's talking about the internal deliberations of the organization, it's not AMC business. But if they're asking you to convey something to AMC or to take a position on AMC, then I think we're clearly into the public records.
Yeah, and I think that's where the confusion lies, right? And that's where it's, trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Identify when that's happening. Yeah, I mean, because quite frankly, I think it's almost impossible to distinguish.
When it's just AOL's discussions versus what you're supposed to convey.
Yeah, because as an AMPC member, I am here representing that organization.
And your job is force policy.
Yeah.
Your normal job. I feel you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not alone.
No.
I was just really trying to get clarity on when that line is crossed, I guess.
And then I just wanted to see if Jason has anything. All right, go ahead.
Matt, I'm involved with a few public records. And some are like, we want emails from these folks with these keywords. They're very specific. And then others are hand us over everything you've got on this topic.
Yeah.
And everything kind of in between. So that's up to the requester for that and being more to the kind of those mechanisms. Like if there's an outside organization, we send in them the keyword, you say enter this and send us the result.
It depends on the requester. Sometimes if you get media, they will be very familiar with how the public records law works and how agencies search records, and they're going to dial everything in so that you know exactly what to do. They'll give you timeframes, they'll give you names, they'll give you keyword searches to make it real easy. Sometimes, say in litigation, they'll say, we want to know everything about this organization or everything about this issue. And that gets really hard for our IT folks to do a search. So sometimes we'll go back to the requester and say, can we narrow this down to a time frame or narrow this down to some keywords? And they'll get an agreement to be more specific, something that meshes with the IT system better. Ultimately, it has to be the requester that agrees to the terms in the search. We can't force that on them. Does that answer it, or was there another piece of it?
Yeah.
Anyone online with questions, Jason or anyone else?
the hand base.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
I'm in a unique situation because I correspond with tribal governments on sovereign trust lands, which creates a unique situation for public laws. So I guess my question as I'm thinking about this is, and I do coordinate with Patrick Flanagan with LCIS as well in terms of updates. But as I'm coordinating with tribal governments, that's a little bit of a unique scenario. I'm just curious if there's any feedback on that.
with tribal governments, nothing that I can speak to off the top of my head. If it's going back to which hat you're wearing, if it's related to AMPC business, I think we're gonna find that it's a public record. There are exceptions for if it was a FOIA request and there's federal laws that would make something confidential, then there are exemptions built in under state law that honor those federal confidentiality rules. I don't know if any of those would necessarily apply to your communications or not, but the public records law in Oregon is written so broadly that it probably would be covered. We would just have to look and see if an exception applies. Yeah, I wish I could give some clear bright line rules here, but that gets back to the idea of a state email address, that if you can. If a judge is looking at this and a judge says, all right, we've got to draw a line somewhere. We've got topics that are private to AOL that are your internal communications. And if we open that up, we would never have AOL on a committee with the state again. So we can't go that far, but we've also got a public records law that we've got to honor. There's got to be a line there somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you, as an initial step, can say, everything in my state email is AMPC business, everything in my private email is not AMPC business, you're drawing a line there.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be easy for a court to adopt and say, all right, we'll honor that line. We're not going to push past it. If they think you're trying to be sneaky and get things in, one place or another, we lose that. But there's got to be a line. And I think that having a state email is a good place for a court to fall on it.
So perhaps a follow-up. And you've referenced emails a lot, but since it's written communications, if Amanda, or as I think ASA, sorry, it's like your ASA, it's me. If she creates a memo that goes to her executive team, that wherever it's housed is still discoverable, correct? So does it need to come back to her email? Or I just thinking like, if there's a Google Doc, right?
If it's stored in both places, if it's stored on a state server, that would be one way to address it.
Okay.
If it's, you're imagining this would be an AMPC document that.
Yeah, so I guess I could use myself then. How about that? So I created a memo. It's stored on my Google Drive. It doesn't live in my state email, right? It lives in the Google Drive. And so when a court ordered or ODF says, hey, I need access to all of your the email is going to be the default folder, but it doesn't include, it's just not the place where it lives. So then you are opening up your storage too, right?
Yes, you could be. And I think that ODF has, you've got Teams, do you have Google Drives that ODF sets up?
Not really, no. It's pretty rare that we do.
If there's any way to set up an ODF Google Drive or, something file sharing system, OneDrive. Yeah. And if that could be the home for it.
Okay. And so that is an issue then. Right?
More than just email.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that scenario, we would ask, MDF would ask Casey for relevant documents. It's not like we would be, you would send us all your storage and then we root around every file. It would just be a transfer of files from him to us that are relevant, right?
If there was a public records request.
Yeah.
That's when this came up for the Board of Forestry, that's how we managed to keep things contained. We asked the board members to send us the stuff that was board related.
Yeah.
And we didn't get any pushback to say, no, we want to search ourselves.
I guess one clear, it's the way that I'm thinking about it, and tell me if this is wrong. It seems like it's more about written documents or written files, whatever when they come in, that have some sort of deliberation in them versus like a report on facts or some sort of update on what's going on? Or is it all of the above? Because it seems like what would be more important would be deliberation.
Yeah, if you've got stakeholders that are sending you facts and they want you to use these facts to inform what the AMPC is doing, then I think it's still going to be conduct of the AMPC.
What's more common, I would think, is for Amanda to report out to people.
Yeah.
Say, here's what's been happening, and here's the schedule to be aware of.
Latest decisions.
Yeah.
And then any feedback on that to say, oh, I'm so happy you're addressing this topic. Have you thought about such and such? Those discussions.
I think typically, Amanda can speak for herself, but I know in my organization, that sort of thing is done verbally.
Yeah.
What usually happens is a report out, some sort of form, right? As part of an agenda with a meeting with a couple of points. And there's a bunch of other stuff on there too. That will go out and then we'll hold a meeting and I'll elaborate a little bit on those things or put in some color if that's needed for a given topic. Answer any questions there are. And then if there's feedback for me about X, Y, or Z, that's done in the meeting. That's the point of the meeting. And that's just verbal feedback. I mean, that's a very typical meeting for me, and I would imagine for Stacy and Amanda and others. I mean, even within all of your organizations.
So I would say at the end of that discussion, you could say if you have, as you're talking to your colleagues, say, if you have other ideas, email me at my state email. And if you take down notes, then you should separate those out and say, these are for AMPC business and they need to be kept in a file that's ready to be discovered if it needs to.
Or I guess, in addition to that, that'd be if there is meetings, meeting minutes that are developed from, or a summary developed from that conversation, that would be discoverable.
And you.
So recognizing that it is.
Proactively redact out all the stuff that's not relevant and put the portion that is AMPC business. And
I think that's really helpful to kind of differentiate between.
And then as long as I'm thinking of not holding a folder. I'm thinking if I'm going to get a ODF email address, I'm just going to email myself that stuff, let it live there. Then I don't have to worry about any separate folder on my file anywhere. It's all there already. And I just keep track. I just keep doing that as things come up. And that way, there's a request. You guys got it.
And I don't know, you may be able to offer file sharing sites so that you could save them on a server somewhere. So you don't have to have your email, but something like that that's on a state server work. And even if there's duplicate copies, we only need to produce one copy and it's easier for us to search when it's on a state server.
All right, so Terry, when are we getting these email addresses?
Look, our new cell phone and PC.
Working on it.
Thanks for your help explaining this.
Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to say that, because we've gotten to some pretty specific examples about what people are doing, and I think the next step would probably be a level that would not be appropriate for a public meeting. And I appreciated your mentioning that it's possible to get, normal attorney-client privileges on these kinds of things because people have shared their personal facts. But at some point, I think naturally, we don't want to do that in a public forum.
Yeah. And what Terry had asked was that I present today without a written document in public setting, but then I take these notes and put them into a memo that would be confidential. And I'm still plan to do that. And that would be something that would be attorney-client privilege between the committee and DOJ. And if there were more questions that came up, we can certainly use that document to justify an executive session. The privilege as well.
Thank you.
I guess Oh, sorry, one
Nope.
last question. Maybe this is for Terry, but how do we call an executive session? Is that, have we talked through that process? Does that exist for this group?
I can address that if you want me to.
Matt, maybe you've got a good answer.
It's, we'd still have to notice it on the agenda and say that there's a public, or there's an executive session pursuant to such and such statute to address, and then we'd have to say generally what the topic is. Members of the media are generally allowed to attend public executive sessions, but otherwise you get to control who comes on. It's listen, you can't make any decisions in executive session. You'd have to go back out of executive session to make the decisions and vote, but for this, you would be able to meet in executive session to review a document that's confidential or privileged, would be the memo advice.
Okay.
Yeah, it's easy to do. A lot of agencies build it into just about every agenda they have.
And just for Terry's benefit, that's Casey, typically that's not recorded as part of the same file so that it's not uploaded with an executive session. Just so that- There, I said it.
Are there questions for Matt or anything else, Matt, that you would highlight for this group?
I think we've covered everything that I had. The last thing I would say is that obviously some gray area. I have that written right here because it's very clear that was going to be an issue. It's not a bright line anywhere. But what I would say with some of the public meetings law, case law that we've had in the last 5 years, what I would say is that with public records, courts are going to look at the policy statement that the legislature said to have an open, transparent government, and they're going to do their best to implement and interpret the statutes to honor that intent, which is promoting government transparency. So if there may be some ways that we can technically get around or try to say something is exempt from the public records law, I think a court's going to look very disfavorable to that, and that we should, whenever we're looking at documents, we should try to look at what the legislative intent is for open, transparent government and expect that that's what we're going to have to live up to. That's the standard we're going to have to live up to. There are lots of other issues with public records law that I'd be happy to address as well. This was a pretty narrow topic on distinguishing private and public records, but I think it's a good discussion and not an easy one to resolve in each situation.
So I do have getting outside of the realm of communication. And, you know, at times we have, like, we just had a work group work on the charter for this, and we, you know, we put our heads together and gave some thoughts to Terry, who finished the draft. So question would be getting together outside of the actual public meetings, you know, and then so there's times where we're going to need to get together to move something forward to then bring it back to the group, like an official work group for this group. Question about that. What's the appropriate size? When do you get, is there a quorum issue there where you get too big, and what is that? And then a separate question, but similar, would be, we're not doing business of this committee. We're not working on something, but we're together. That happens fairly often because we all work in the same space. And so it's not uncommon for Stacy and I and Casey and maybe Amanda or maybe even Dave or others to be in the same meeting talking about something else. It's not the business of the AMPC. When do we get into trouble there? Or is that okay? Or what's too big, too many? So those questions about quorum and meeting outside of here.
Yeah. So that's a great segue. The two topics that Terry asked me to address were public records and public meetings. So
Okay, perfect.
next piece is all about public meetings. Exactly those questions. Yeah. So I'll
Go for it.
try to get to those as I go through this next piece. But I did have a little bit of an introduction about the public meetings law in general that I wanted to go through before I respond to those. That's okay. So the public meetings law is in statute as well, ORS 192.610. And as with the public records law, the courts are going to look at what the purpose and the intent for the public meetings law is. And so it's framed up fairly well in statute. And I'll just read what the legislature has said. The Oregon form of government requires an informed public aware of the deliberations and decisions of governing bodies and the information upon which such decisions were made. It's the intent of the public meetings law that decisions of governing bodies be arrived at openly. There's three general things that the public meetings law requires. It's that the meetings and deliberations are open to the public. The public has notice of the time and place of the hearings of the meetings, and the meetings are accessible to anybody that wants to attend. I think it's notable that the public meetings law is not a public participation law. There's no general obligation that the public be afforded an opportunity to participate. You just have to be able to observe. That's the general public meetings law, but for AMPC, you do have a rule specifically that says the AMPC will provide for public testimony at meetings. So you do have an obligation to allow for that public testimony, but it's specific to the AMPC and not part of the public meeting law. Regarding quorum, so you have, if I'm getting this right, you have 10 voting members and 3 non-voting members. Is that right? So the voting members don't count towards quorum, but any gathering of 6 or more members to discuss AMPC business would constitute a public meeting and require notice and public, the ability of the public to observe. With that quorum, Oregon law is a little bit unique from some other entities in that only a majority can take action on behalf of the committee. So say you've got 7 people that show up to a particular meeting. That's enough for quorum. It's enough to hold an official meeting. But if you have a vote on something and only 5, say 5 of the 7 vote in favor, that's a majority of those attending, but it's not a majority of the AMPC. So you wouldn't be able to take official action on a vote of 5 people. You would need to have 6, a majority of the 10, in order to take an official action. So it gets difficult if you have less than everybody here. If you're trying to operate on consensus, it may not ever come up, but it's a unique feature that doesn't exist in a lot of private organizations. So then, Seth, to get to your question about subcommittees, this was one of the questions that Terry asked. The public meetings law has specific provisions for public bodies and governing bodies, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds of defining those terms, but I think just suffice it to say that the AMPC, if the AMPC creates a subcommittee and charges that subcommittee with a task of bringing a recommendation back to the full committee, then the subcommittee is going to be subject to the public meetings law. And we'll have to give notice and an opportunity for the full to attend. If it's, say it's a subcommittee of 3 people, then that would work. If it's a subcommittee of 6 people, then it would actually be a full meeting of the AMPC, and you would give notice that it's a meeting of the AMC. But let's say it's less than quorum, so 3 people, it would be subject to the public meetings law. Yeah.
I missed the very beginning thing you said there about whether we were gonna, the kind of action that would be taken by the subcommittee. Could you say again, what kind of action?
Yeah, and that's an important distinguishing characteristic here. If the AMC charges this subcommittee with bringing a recommendation back or voting and making some decision that will then come back to the full committee, that is subject to the public meetings law. The distinguishing characteristic is if the AMC says, all right, you 3 committee members, we want you to go out and hear public input on a topic. Or we want you to go out and hear, do research on a particular issue and then come back to us with your individual recommendations. That's not subject to public meetings law because the three committee members are not reaching an agreement on a recommendation or a decision, but they're coming back with their own individual input. It's a weird issue with public meetings law, but if they're making their individual recommendations, they don't have to comply with public
My
meetings law.
question then would focus on whether you can just do work, have a subcommittee do some work, come back neutral, where it's not saying we're making a recommendation here, but this is draft us further down the line. And let's have the whole committee think about it. That's not a recommendation, in my opinion.
Or it could be individual recommendations where the three committee members come back and say, here's how I think we should move forward.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and sorry, yeah.
So I'd answer that sort of differently, I think, because I would almost think that if the three of them got together and did work, came up with a recommendation, that is in fact a decision, even though it's not voted on, just the consensus of thought, that is in fact a decision. And so if a subcommittee, if three people are going to bring back a recommendation or send forward, these are our recommendations, or we've met, and here is the summary of where we think we should go, or any sort of bringing together of thought, I believe that's a decision and would need to be public meeting that you've done this, you plan to do this, and it's now come out. So so just be careful. To me, that's a finer than you went.
Okay. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. If it's a draft that the three people have said this is the draft we want to put forward, or they're going to agree on a set of recommendations and they've reached an agreement there, then that is public meetings law.
Yeah.
But if they're just gathering information and they don't talk about it, but then they go back to the full AMC and say, here's what I heard, or here's what I would take away.
Concur.
Yeah.
Jason and then Terry.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like then that we really can't have subcommittees that are working through a process that's going to come back to the whole committee without having some sort of public meeting law tie. I mean, because getting individual recommendations kind of defeats the purpose of having the subcommittee to begin with. It's just one of
So, yeah, one of the alternatives that I think would be helpful is if the AMPC says to Terry, we want you to produce a report or a draft document that covers whatever topic. And Terry, as you're developing this, we want you to work with committee members, name 3 committee members. Then it's up to Terry to produce that report, to make the decision and to decide what is presented back to the full committee. Because it's Terry as an individual, the public meetings law doesn't apply to an individual's deliberations or decisions. Terry can go through whatever process he wants to draft that document. If it's ultimately his decision, then the public meetings law doesn't apply to that.
Terry and then Julie.
I think my question got answered. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like mine was pretty much answered, but, and just to put a finer point on that, Matt, if I were to say, hey, you 3 people, let's get together in a room in Zoom, I want to hear your opinions and I'll make the final decision. Is that still not a public meeting? If I'm just hearing their opinions and they're talking and it's non-quorum and they're talking and then they give me their ideas and I take it all that and make a decision on the input that I hear, is that not a public meeting then?
Right. We're getting closer to some gray areas. So what I would say is it's less of a risk if you are the ultimate decision maker, kind of like with the state forester. The state forester can pull together whoever he wants to help him make a decision, but ultimately it's his decision. And he is not subject, you don't see a public meeting notice for every time the state forester wants to make a decision. It's an individual. And if the individual has control and is making that decision, public meetings law will not apply. You certainly can go through whatever process you want to help inform your decision. You could meet with individual board members, you could meet with the entire board individually to help inform your decision. As long as it's not a decision of the board or a decision of that subcommittee, it's your decision. There's much less of a risk that it's going to violate public.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Seth and then Josh.
So I'm assuming that when you say that it triggers a public meeting, so say we do have a work group, and that work group is going to come up with a draft of something. So we're not gonna work through Terry. Terry will be involved, but
Yep.
more as a scribe, and the committee members will give input and deliberate. In that scenario, it is a public meeting. How much in advance do you have to notice that public meeting? And then I'm assuming there would also have to be a opportunity for public comment, that sort of thing, even in that setting, or is there not? So I'm trying to also think, instead of, you got the workarounds, but if we're not gonna do the workaround, we're just gonna call it what it is. It's a public meeting. What's the process and how onerous is that?
There's no specific timeline for how far in advance you have to give notice of a meeting. I think the statute says reasonably calculated to inform interested parties of the meeting. Some agencies will say a week in advance, but there's nothing in the public meetings law that specifically requires it, except for special meetings, which is interesting that you have to give 24 hours notice of a special meeting. So that kind of sets the shortest time frame.
None of our meetings are special.
Yeah.
They're all.
Yeah, so reasonably calculated, give notice that is far enough in advance that members of the public could attend if they want to.
Okay, so that kind of leaves it up to us a little bit to figure that out.
Yeah.
Then the public comment piece, do we have to have that with every one of those, or is it good enough to give the public notice when it's a smaller group like that?
And this is in AMC rules, this is not public meetings law, but the AMC rule says the AMC shall conduct their meetings per AMC charter, and all AMC meetings shall be conducted as public meetings consistent with the Oregon Public Meetings Law. The AMC will provide for public testimony at meetings unless the chairperson determines that doing so would be detrimental to the conduct of the AMC's business. Pretty broad.
That's in our rule.
That's in your rule.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see that as separating out subcommittees or specific topics or.
Not that I don't, I mean, personally, I don't think that would be that difficult anyway, right? I mean, notice the meeting, whatever, a couple of days in advance or whatever is necessary, and
Provide a public.
and say, is there anybody here from the public? If there is, you want to say anything? Okay, let's start talking about the charter or whatever it is that we're talking about, right?
Those require I'll raise my hand. It does require an agenda, a way for the person to attend, and also then minutes afterwards.
Yeah.
I believe, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it would be just like a public meeting. All the elements, yep.
I add on a question. Yeah, it was slightly different. So it seemed like that language had a little bit of discretion for the chair. Like, is that a place where for a smaller group of three that there would be a little more flexibility for that, or is that even grayer than gray?
No, I think that unless the chairperson determines that doing so would be detrimental to the conduct of the AMC's business, I think that gives quite a bit of discretion for the chair to say, this meeting, maybe for this topic, you're not going to do public comment.
Josh, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I am on a different topic within public meetings. Fully comfortable with wrapping that up a little bit. So I have my question, I don't know how well I've got it formulated. It's more about like deliberation and discussion and kind of the question of serial quorum.
That's the next piece of this. So I just want with subcommittees. Yeah. Serial meetings. So that's.
Well, I mean, I got both the state agency worker thing, and then I'm elected in the state of Washington, so I'm kind of getting this from both ends, but So I guess my question is, if people on the committee will have conversations with each other, verbal conversations that do reflect on AMC business. And so I guess I'm looking for, are there lines or guidance on when you kind of hit a serial quorum through verbal discussion specifically, not through email. And then, if a number of committee members have talked about something and come to agreement outside of it, how much discussion is necessary within a public meeting in order for that to be legitimate? People might have conversations, that person talk, and then one of the people from that conversation talks to someone else and they talk to another person. So you've got this kind of web of communication that say eventually wraps in 6 or 7 of 10 voting members.
Yeah.
And it hasn't happened all at once. It hasn't all been everyone talking to each other at the same time, but those conversations have occurred. Is that in and of itself an issue? Or does that, whether or not that's an issue, depend on whether then everyone is discussing that topic thoroughly in the public meeting? Then is that sort of web of communication allowable if you're also coming into a public meeting to have a thorough discussion about it? Or is that sort of thing just kind of right out and once you hit a certain number of members having talked about it?
Do you want me to?
Sorry, David.
It's kind of a amendment to that question.
Yeah, okay.
And particularly, are there distinctions for committee members versus affiliated staff? Question.
So serial or sequential meetings is certainly a hot topic with public meetings law. There was a situation in Lane County from a few years ago where one of the commissioners who was a former legislator and attorney who knew the rules and was trying to hold serial meetings in an attempt to not have to have the conversation in public. So this gets back to my point earlier that the courts are going to look at what the spirit of the law is and say, we want to have deliberations in public. And if somebody's trying to use very technical arguments to get around that, courts are going to be pretty hard on them. So we do have some case law recently that talks directly about serial deliberations. And I think we've got some cautious advice that we would offer with falling back on the idea that what's the intent? Are you trying to get around the public meetings law, or are you just having social conversations? And not very, very careful, but it is something that you do need to be concerned about. So the note that I have on this topic is if you've got the situation as a group of committee members constituting less than a quorum, they may not meet in serial or sequential meetings to deliberate on the topic. It doesn't prevent, or it shouldn't prevent any of the committee members from talking about a topic outside of a meeting, but you should avoid any discussions that appear to link the various discussions into one broader serial deliberation. It could come up in a few different ways. One is in-person meetings, and the other is through exchange of an email. I'll address email real quick just to get that out of the way. But if somebody sends the full committee a document and says, we want you to consider this document for the upcoming agenda topic, and then a committee member does a reply all, and all of a sudden you've looped in everybody on the committee in this discussion that's not a public meeting, but it's deliberations towards a topic that are on the agenda, that would be a serial meeting. So what ODF often does is when they send out an agenda, they'll send it as a blind carbon copy to everybody. So you can't inadvertently reply all to help protect against that. The other piece of this is in-person, something you mentioned. So the example that I had is committee member A talks to committee members B and C, and then committee member A goes over and talks to committee members D, E, and F. So we've got 6 people involved. There's the risk that those 2 different meetings could essentially become an ongoing deliberation in violation of the public meetings law. You can reduce that risk by
if subcommittee or committee member A talks to D, E, and F. I apologize if that's just too convoluted, but yeah, don't convey what committee members B and C said. Right? If it's just a conversation between these four people, it's not a public meeting. But if committee member A or staff member tries to then link up what other conversations have been, or tries to negotiate something that would be a middle ground, that's going to be more like a deliberation. If it's just a conversation and it stays in that bubble, it's a safer approach. I'm not going to say it's completely within public meetings law, but it's safer. There's.
Sorry, I have a question.
Don't sound okay.
It's your initial hypo was that
Yeah.
like the person, there would be a reply all, so there'd be everybody.
Mhm.
And then you talked about smaller groups. Could you just clarify again what number of people could have like ABC conversation and it not be a meeting of the committee? What number of people?
5 or less.
Okay.
If you get to 6, that's for this group, that's the magic number.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to do a quick time check because we've now pushed through our break
Oh.
and into the next section, and this has been really, really helpful. So I don't want to cut this short, but I know we also have a few other things to get through.
Yes.
Any final questions, thoughts on follow-up?
I have one other question. So similar to kind of what I said earlier about how each one of us here are representing an organization and in the looking but this way on the table. I don't know if it's in the statute or in the rules, but you know, where those organizations are lined out. Would quorum just be met by these specific individuals or people representing these organizations?
The individuals that are named as AMC members.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think you can send proxies in this group, can you?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if a person is functioning as a proxy for you, then I suppose they could be considered
Okay.
part of that.
We may run into this issue pretty often.
I'm mostly thinking about the compliance monitoring.
Well, compliance monitoring
Yeah.
and Board of Forestry meetings, frankly,
Yeah, that's true.
where a number of us are present at those meetings fairly often.
Yeah, although I don't know how much of the, I guess for a public meeting law, but we're not typically doing the business of the AMPC at those
No.
meetings, but whereas I feel like there's a little bit more of a potential direct tie with the compliance.
And if you're in the same room together, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a public meeting.
Okay.
It's if you've gotten together and are talking about something that is on the AMC agenda or relevant to the AMC.
Okay.
You can get together and talk about, all 10 of you could get together and talk about fly fishing all you wanted.
Well, but at those Board of Forestry meetings, they're almost always gonna have some sort of subject
About,
that is related in some way.
But if you're just listening to it, that's, yeah, I mean, there's some risk that if you all go to a conference and you all get the same information, that would be a public meeting. But if you are there and not deliberating with each other, it's not as likely that it will be called a public meeting.
So Josh, then Casey.
I
and
don't
then-
need to, yeah. I think we're, yeah, my last follow-up should be quick on that. So if A, to use your giving people letters, which is handy, if A, B, and C have a conversation, come to an agreement and then sort of radiate outward to where A is talking to D and E,
Yeah.
B is talking to, at G and H and so on, that would be a serial quorum, to be clear, right?
I believe it would, yeah.
Okay.
And that may be, it may be further than a court is willing to go, but I think there's a really high risk that a
Okay.
court would find that serial
Yeah.
deliberations.
Yeah, so the key point is there's discussion happening, whether in single group or multiple groups that involves, in our case,
Yeah.
6 or more members on something that should be deliberated publicly.
Yeah.
and even, and just kind of what you brought up before, and that's even if the specifics of that deliberation come up in very similar manner in the public meeting.
Well, and there was a point I wanted to address also. There is a way that you can cure a violation. That's by going to the public meeting and restating the substance of what private deliberations was.
Okay.
Sort of a mea culpa. Hey, here's what we talked about. I wouldn't rely on that, but if.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know. That's good to know.
Maybe I'll have to be very quick with it. And this is to come back to the subcommittees and work groups, because there was some clarification that those public, those will be considered public meetings, and that's a very small group of people, right? It could be two. And so I want to get clarification so that we don't get hung up on, oh, it's 6 or it's 5, but if it's 2 people, is that if Julie and I meet and then Julie presents to the group a deliberation, or does that count as a public meeting then?
If the AMC directed you to meet.
Okay.
Come up with recommendation, it would.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
if you're just doing that on your own to, try to come up with a position that you two think you should put forward independently, that would be good.
Okay, thank you.
That is a good clarification.
I was a little worried. Sometimes I stalk the Stacy, so.
If you did that with 5 other people.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
I guess I'm curious of a follow-up. I think maybe we would all benefit from an executive session at some point, kind of follow up with some more specific questions. I have a sense that there's more answers we're seeking, and just really appreciate you joining us here. So maybe as a next step, we can add an executive session to one of our upcoming meetings to kind of focus on this. Does that make sense? Both
Yeah,
or other suggestions?
especially when he comes, because you're gonna draft up the memo from this, and that would probably be a good nexus to schedule an executive session with follow-up questions and stuff.
And if there's any questions or any specific points you want me to build into that memo, send Terry a message and Terry can let me know. And hopefully that written document can be helpful, but if there's any more discussion, I'm absolutely happy to come back and talk.
Great.
Great, thank you very much.
And I guess I would secondly propose maybe like a very short 3-minute break, Terry, and then we come back at like 1:55 and jump into the biological goals and objectives and our research topics. Does that work for folks? Okay.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Seth, tell me if I'm off base, but I think Terry will be bringing a recommendation on the charter that Wendy and Seth and I were all okay with. So as a suggestion, maybe we want to flip the agenda, so we just get the charter out of the way. We may need less time for that than what we've got on the agenda.
I
And
guess
then
the
we would have
only-
more time for EGOs and research topics.
Yes, only hesitation is I think Adrian and Sean are joining us,
Okay.
and we've already maybe kicked them back a little bit in time.
I'm okay, Stacy, and Sean isn't going to be able to make it. So I can happily stay on mute and work on some other things. If that helps you guys. I'm flexible, so just do what you guys need to do.
No, yeah, he's on. That's it.
It's for you, Adrian, and that generally run good with kind of bumping that order a little bit. Okay, awesome. So let's come back at 1:55. We'll talk through the charter. And have a longer discussion. on
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Ended up with individual.
Yeah, sure, right.
Elections. Benton County case filed by the enterprise. Because they have.
Okay, I think clear.
For deliberations in terms of how they feel about this, that they would share their thoughts on topics. And they judge felt that that was clear violation. Because it was a clear deliberation. Reasonably come before them in the future policy. They all fine.
Yeah.
Yes. No one lost their
I
job.
didn't ask this because I think you already answered, but that's perfect.
I get
Yeah.
Just so you know, it is recording stuff.
Okay.
if we're moving or unmute ourselves at least.
I get it.
And moving our agenda around slightly, we're gonna bump up the discussion of the AMP charter. And this is likely a substantial decision item. So I guess just framing it up for folks, we've had some discussion around the charter at a few meetings now. There's been a smaller group that did some this work on that. And so maybe I'll just turn it over to Seth, Dr. Wendy, maybe to run us through any changes or things you want to highlight from the most recent draft.
Maybe the best way to do it would be to have Gary. The way we did that, so Terry had the responsibility to make the decision on bringing the recommendation, and we gave thoughts into his drafting.
You advised him.
This, yeah.
Yeah.
Gave some thoughts on his drafting, so
Okay.
it might make sense for Terry to do it. What do you think, Terry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I got everyone's ideas and made sure I understood everyone's perspectives, and then I made the final decision to pull something together and email it out. I believe it was approximately 10 days ago for you folks to look at before the meeting. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to read through and go, yeah, this looks good enough for now. And you know, it really is pretty much ready. And I guess the question is, did folks have any things that they see that they want to talk about, modify?
I had three things. They're both really simple. Only one of them is critical, I think. On page 2, where there are the bullets saying AMPC members will maintain the integrity of the committee and public forums by. The last 2 bullets, I think, need to be reworded to say avoid doing these things rather than do those things.
Similar option would be to put avoid here and.
Yeah, exactly. One or the other.
I'm misrepresenting this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, good point. Yep, my bad. Thanks.
Exactly.
Communicating in other minds to undermine the trust.
It is humorous.
Yeah, and then the top 2 bullets.
Good job, Vinny.
Okay, yes, you're welcome.
Thank you.
2 other things are, throughout the document, ODF is referenced as ODF accept under the second paragraph, where it just says the department, and maybe it would be more consistent to say ODF there as well. But not a big deal. And the last one I had was the last sentence of section 6. It might be a little clearer to say should have fewer than 6. But again, that's not a big deal. You don't have to do the or more and the how the not applies, and that's all I got.
We need more.
Brand new.
The problem.
It fixed it for like 10 minutes.
So those are, I think, relatively minor, Julie. Maybe send those to Terry.
Sure, absolutely.
Keep us.
Mhm.
Any issues with those changes?
No.
Anyone else with questions? Changes? That's the only that I would flag is the conflict of interest piece, and just had a little discussion around that. Maybe that's a place where this type of memo from Department of Justice could provide some insight to the group about how to approach that conflict of interest element of our charter. And I don't know that that needs to hold us up today for moving forward, but I guess I would just put that out to the group of, is there utility in getting that kind of memo that would confidential memo that would inform this committee about conflict of interest as it's appropriate, given that we are all here because we represent organizations or agencies and have a conflict of interest in some sense, but we're also chosen to be on the group for that. Yes.
We did discuss
We
that
did,
at
great.
some length and on exactly that point. So and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of where I think we ended up after some discussion that's just such a challenging area. And, you know, most of the organizations here have an interest and that's why they're here. So we had some discussion about just removing that for now, given that we can, as a later substantial decision, amend the charter to add something like that in there if it becomes necessary or some specific language governing behavior seems advisable. That's something we can add later on. So I think we kind of gotten around to the idea of maybe we want to throw out the idea of let's take that out, put the rest of the charter forward, which is about how we operate. And then if we have some legal advice, which can be binding that we need to put in a separate policy or add to the charter later, we can.
If I could add, my thought about that was partly just that conflict of interest rules apply to us nonetheless, and rather than trying to summarize them in the charter, it made sense simply to inform ourselves about them.
Yes.
Yes. And if I could just throw in that I looked at the Oregon Government Ethics Commission's, it's like a guide for public officials. And it has a section in there about conflict of interest. And the thing that I noted was that there was specific language that said, if a person's membership on a committee is because they represent a particular group, then they don't need to announce the conflict of interest, that there could be a conflict of interest. And so I still want to confirm that my interpretation, my understanding is accurate, but yeah, that's an option that could get.
That's helpful, Terry. And that was kind of, so my thought and asking around other folks and how other committees work that are similarly structured with stakeholders, that was the feedback that I had received as well. But I don't disagree. I mean, having that as a discussion with DOJ never hurts, and tell us about where, for example, what Terry was reading and where other places where this is elaborated on, it's helpful. So.
And that will also help lay out the appropriate procedural response if we decide in some situation that there is an actual conflict of interest that requires some sort of change in what we do.
I wonder if that could be added to the charter as like an addendum or something, just so that it's easily accessible. Something like that, because I mean, when I think about conflicts of interest, I appreciate what Terry mentioned, that's very, clear. We all are here because we represent an interest, but where a conflict could arise is if a certain organization is perhaps doing research or wanting to, propose some, that they want to do some of the research, or something like that.
Outlined in the rule. Isn't that outlined in the rule for the IRSD? I thought it was.
The IRSP, but maybe not.
Oh,
with
yeah.
this.
So if one of our organizations wanted to do some research.
Yeah, or
from this organization.
yeah, or something like that, or like for those that do own forest lands that might be impacted by the rules. I mean, that could be another potential conflict. So I don't know, I think it's important to have it in there, but I understand kind of recognizing maybe we're not ready to put it in or might have the wrong words. And so maybe an addendum might, make sure that we have the right words, but not trying to summarize it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just want to check, anyone online? Jason, any thoughts? I can't see you, so if you're raising your hand.
No, I don't have any other thoughts.
Okay. Casey?
Yeah, I think that in terms of First, thanks to the work group members.
Mhm.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, agree.
Or the group who gathered
Who gave?
and shared their thoughts with Terry.
The individuals.
Exactly. Thinking about the charter, with respect to state statute around conflicts of interest and how to cure them and how to proceed. It seems like there should at the very least be a in the see which section would that be? Just looking for where it was with the other ones. It does seem like there should be a reference to the statute. Partly because in one of the other spots, there's here's how to have somebody vote in your interim or as proxy. And if somebody's stepping into that, they now have, oh, this is a public meeting, all this is subject to public records. And then it doesn't have in there, the other thing that I consider pretty important, which is how to deal with your personal versus public responsibilities. So I think it'd be valuable to have it in there, even if it's just a reference to the fact that we're all in some level subject to Oregon's conflict of interest laws by virtue of being public officials.
Just to clarify your suggestion, you would like to add maybe just a line or sentence or two that just says, you know, AMC members are subject to follow the existing ORS on conflict of interest.
I think that would be very helpful. I think future members would appreciate that reminder.
Can I ask a question?
Oh,
Are
yeah.
you suggesting like a statement that we're subject to conflicts rules of interest rules, just and adding a procedural, like what the procedural step?
No,
would be?
no,
Like
because
before it
that's
said,
really
like,
up
the
to-
chair should do something about it. So what is your suggestion?
Well, ultimately, the chair won't be informed about what each of us individually needs to do for public, for declaring or handling conflicts of interest. So it is really incumbent upon each one's responsibility. But I think it would be valuable for members of the committee to be reminded of the fact that they have that personal responsibility. Because as far as I understand, it really is a personal, it runs with the person.
So I think it's just a sentence and not developing any process like we did in previous drafts, but that just says, as AMC members, we follow whatever the citation is as appropriate for conflict of interest, public officials. Other thoughts?
That may be fine. I would want to ensure that we are referencing the correct statute.
Yeah.
And not referencing one that is not the appropriate statute for our situation. And therefore binding us in a way that we are not actually intending. So if we're gonna do that, I think that should be, I like the idea of putting forward this draft. I would be in favor of approving this draft, tabling this as a discussion with DOJ input. And if there is, once we get clarity around what statute would be the appropriate statute to reference for this group, I would be fine with something like that. But I would be uncomfortable doing that on a whim.
Amanda, and then maybe.
Oh, sorry. That's legacy.
Still, okay. So.
I haven't been very good with my hand raising.
So I'm hearing that there's interest in addressing this. There'd be some value in DOJ input, maybe an addendum is the appropriate way to do that. Generally, are folks okay moving forward with agreements to have that conversation and address that in an addendum? Or is there another approach?
So you're make a
Generally,
comment.
Yeah. Okay, so then it seems like maybe we're ready for a vote, substantial decision to move forward.
A motion.
And let's see the wording, how you drafted, change if you wouldn't mind, the section.
Pointed out.
Yeah, that Julie pointed out the error.
I added avoiding up to the top level. And removed all of the
The refrain from.
refraining and avoiding. So these are avoiding certain
All of these
actions.
things.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so would anyone?
It's all that fun.
I move that we adopt the charter of the Adaptive Management Program Committee as presented to us with the minor change that was in the section of communication.
Oops.
Do we need to have that written out and?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I did draft something along the, yeah, okay, great.
Good job.
Go back up a little bit.
No, just that's
Charter. Okay, that's the charter.
That'll be motion one.
Modified.
As modified.
as modified. Yep.
And I'll second that motion if there's not a second already.
All right. A motion and a second. So as a substantial decision, I believe then we do a roll call.
Yep.
Carrie, do you kick that off or? Sorry, no. So do I kick it off? There.
Yes, I.
Casey votes aye.
Julie votes aye.
Wendy votes aye.
Amanda votes aye.
Will Tucker votes aye.
Josh Seeds votes aye.
Seth Barnes votes aye.
Stacy votes aye.
Jason votes aye.
I think that's all. Yeah, awesome, guys.
Motion passes.
Great. So I think we're ready to tackle the next topic.
Yes. I think we can.
Great. And Adrian, I'm gonna do a little bit of kickoff that will help set you up. Research side, that's it. And we'll lay a little bit of foundation for a little better context for folks. And then Adrian, I'll hand the table over to you in about 10-ish minutes. So if you go to the next slide. So this is a process chart that I showed a while back, and I want to put a little more detail on it. And so I'm not going to step through it here because I'll step through it on the next slide. So this is sort of the nitty-gritty details, but still in a simplified way. So this, what I'm going to, so this is an example of the entire cycle for one question with a few other things that go along in the way. And so what I did was, this is the same chart that I emailed folks a few days ago, but I hid some rows just to make it easier to consume. And don't worry about getting every single detail right. There's a lot of detail. I could probably spend 2 hours discussing this, but I want you to get sort of the big picture of the order of operations and an approximation, a guesstimate of how long things will take. So if we look at the first row, AMC identifies research questions and then sends it over to IRST. So that's happening in sort of third and fourth quarter, maybe a little bit of fourth quarter 2023, first quarter 2024. IRST gets that question. They get a whole bunch of questions, but for the purpose of this discussion, they get question one and they say, okay, did we, to make this a researchable question, let's reframe it just a little bit. AMC, did we get that? Are we still capturing the intent of what you're looking for? And then AMC responds, actually, it should be like this, it should be like that. And then it comes back and IRST develops, I call it a proposal. A better term might be sort of a draft scope of work, so that, which would include, here's a light literature review to help us inform, to know what this is about. Here's the approximate time frame and cost. If we did it route A, it would cost $2 million. Route B would cost $300,000, and here's the level of certainty, number of sites, et cetera. And so they do that for a whole bunch of, for several questions, and it comes back to the AMC in this example in Q1 of 2025. And AMC takes these potential proposals, potential workflows, and says, okay, given the amount of money we have, the amount of time, these are our priorities, and here's our research agenda. We're going to forward that onto the board. In the meantime, AMC will have an opportunity to say, are there any research topics or questions that we want to add? So as needed at this time, do we want to add any? Then the board approximately in third quarter of 2025 says, yeah, this agenda, we'll make a decision on the research agenda. Yeah, we've got the money, we've got this looks like a good amount of time and money, and they kick it over to the IRST here in green, where it says IRST RFP. So that means writing an RFP, putting it on the street, picking a award winner for question 1. So that'll take, on the order of 4 to 6 months probably, which puts us in early 2026. And then IRST develops a contract, awards it, manages it. And I say RST, and it's really IRST with oodles and oodles of help from INR. And so exactly in Q3 of 26 through Q3 of 27, they're doing it. Let's say it's a lighter project, like maybe a literature review, and it only takes a year. So then that comes back to the results of that come back to the AMC in Q3 of 2027, and AMC says, here's what we think of that. Here's what we think should happen. Spanning the range from everything's fine, keep things the way they are, to we need more information, to there should be changes in rules or training. And then they kick that onto the board in this example in Q4 of 2027. And the board looks at the AMC reports and the results from the IRST and has some decision. And then along the way, AMC in that process is also refining the research agenda, getting the board input on it, and the cycle continues on with question 2, et cetera. So going to the next slide, if you would, please. A couple of things to highlight. So this is even when it's simplified, there's a lot to this process. So just to keep that in mind, it's pretty complex. This is all spelled out in rule, mostly in 629, 603-0200. And the other thing is that one research topic could have several questions that are big questions that might take years to answer. And even there's a ramp up phase here to all of your work, and then it'll become more of a regular cycle, not regular, it'll become a cycle with things happening at different times. But even with a pretty fast results from this first study, it's, the board, your decision is 4.5 years from now. So just for you to understand sort of the timing of that. And then if we go to the next slide, the last takeaway I want to make is that, AMC, you folks will have chances to update both the research topics and the questions regularly. It's actually, you'll be sending questions as needed to the IRC on a regular basis. And if you could always say, you know what, we have so much already going in the hopper, let's not add more to it right now, but it is an option regularly, annually to revisit that. So any questions in terms of that big picture without necessarily diving way into the weeds on all the details, but any questions on the layout of how that first chart that shows the simplified processes actually flows into this time, this is a very rough timeline. example. And so any questions at this stage of the game before I hand it over to Adrian?
Terry, I have a clarifying question. Sorry if I missed this, but so in those first like lines 2 to 4, we have question 1, which you kind of referred to as, it's not just one question, it's a set of questions. And then further down, you have questions 1 to 3.
Right.
So I'm sorry, I missed, so so each of those are a set of questions like 2 and 3?
Well, yeah, let me try and clarify that. In this example, question 1 really is one researchable question. Here's our big research question. Now, it could have some little sub questions within it, but it's really one question. And then I threw in this line that's the AMC develops research agenda questions 1 through 3. That's to show that actually in the very first line that says AMC identifies research questions and sends them to IRST, there's multiple questions 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. Let's say you send 4 questions, four research questions. Those could cover 4 separate research topics or 2 research topics. But the point is, I included the line in this particular visual with questions 1 through 3, since a research agenda is likely going to be more than just one question. And so at this stage of the game that says develops research agenda, the AMC is going to say, okay, we got all this information on multiple questions, which I don't show all the details of IRST proposals on questions 2 and 3 just for simplicity here, but know that there will be a whole batch of information like that for the AMC to consider. Hopefully that clarified it.
Yeah. Thanks. That's helpful.
Other questions for Terry on this? Go ahead.
Question that I have is that when you look at this time frame, assuming that your time frame extends out to the end of 2028, it looks like the actual implementation of the research agenda is shorter than the time it takes to go through the upfront work. And, just based on my experience with some research in natural biological systems, they could take a long time. And so I'm just wondering that if there's questions that really have serious impact to the public, or whatever it is, if there's a way to perhaps condense that front end up to allow more time to actually do the real work, and then thereby getting an answer that would help to alleviate, whatever the issue is.
Right. So just to clarify, in this example, I picked it super for question 1. If it were a lit review, which is actually in rule to do 1 lit review for, I think it's Eastern Oregon slopes, that could be shorter. But as you look down here and see question 2 of the research agenda, that's 2.25 years just to do that research. And that's, again, that could be on the short side. There could be studies that are 3-5 years easily. So there's no expectation that the research is going to be faster than is appropriate. Having said that, in terms of your first part of your question, there's a modest amount of things that are in rule that do need to happen process-wise in terms of some back and forth, so that you give the IRST a batch of information on questions that is makes it so that they understand the context. And this is where I didn't get into all the details, but there's a fair amount of information for the IRST to even be able to hone the question and develop a proposal. And then those proposals that come back to you, there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to chew on. So that's going to take, just setting that research agenda is going to take some time to think through that big batch of information and discuss it. So hopefully I addressed your question. Go ahead.
As a follow-up, I mean, if you look at this timeline, Q4 of 2024, nothing's going on, or it doesn't look like anything.
So, right, and so that's where I hid a bunch of lines. So if you look at the actual spreadsheet I sent, there's stuff happening. But if you think about IRST doing a proposal for question 2, question 3, question 4, there's a lot of work going on in Q4 there, Q3, Q4, et cetera. So, and then there will be pauses in your work based on what those other ones, on what IRST is doing. You know, you'll hand a bunch of information over and it'll take a little while for them to develop, for example, proposal related to that, to those questions. So this is where already what's here is so complex, but it doesn't even capture the full picture. So it looks like there's gaps, but there in reality is not. And we could pull that up and go through that, but
That should just get, see the timeline.
yeah, if you look at the, yeah, exactly, integrated and scroll, oops. Yeah, there we are. So that, and again, these are also, don't forget, these are rough estimates for how long all these things will take. And it's, some of this is new and will take, especially at the beginning, will take a little more time until we get our process down. Some of these steps here likely will take a little bit longer.
So
I appreciate you doing this, Terry. I just wanted to say that, you know, Stacy and I in prepping for this meeting with Terry, we thought it would be useful to have this sort of discussion just to help people sort of orient your minds on what you're on the process here. And it's going to take a while to get good. And once we get into the groove, then then there will be, you know, some of this stuff will be happening sort of simultaneously, and it won't feel like, I don't think it won't feel like things are taking a long time. It'll feel like we're on to the next thing, and there's a constant workflow that was part of this. But I think it's useful to keep in mind, like, we're not going to get studies like tomorrow, right? I think everybody knows that, but having the timeline in front of you is useful just to kind of remind yourself of what, you know, how that process is. And I also think it, Dave, maybe to some of your point, or to address it a little bit, I would say it probably depends on the question too, right? And some of them are quicker getting through a process than others, right? And you alluded to that, Terry, with regards to a literature review versus a full-blown before-after comparison, right? So there'll be different timelines associated with different questions. So
Julie and then Amanda.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I recognize that it's complicated and that there's a lot to work out, but I just wanted to echo David's concern and my hope, you know, maybe realistically, that's where it'll be. That'll be 2.5 years before we get a first RFP out, but I would hope that it's sooner than that. So definitely would make all efforts to move things along if possible.
Amanda?
I guess my question related to, you know, the AMPC versus the IRST. I know that there's going to be this iterative process, and there's, you know, on the Excel sheet, there's more of what's going to be happening, but where there aren't blue blocks for this group, are there going to be, like, it's not really worked in here, but when are we going to have times for IRST to, like, come talk to us? I guess is my question is, like, I assume that where there isn't a blue block doesn't mean that we aren't going to have a meeting. There isn't going to be some sort of coordination. So can you just explain, like, when that would happen, like when and how we would get those proposals from them?
Right. So that's still somewhat in flux, and I think we're actually, there's what's in rule, and then there's us both internally and with co-chairs and you folks going, what makes the most sense in terms of a workflow and a you know, making the gargantuan buffet of stuff consumable. How do we best pace that so that the information is easy to consume and make sense of? And there's a bit of work to do to figure that out, because these proposals are going to have a modest amount of, they're not going to be a two-page document. There's going to be some things to think about. And so, yes, there will be conversations with the IRST, and you're right, just because there isn't some blue on that timeline doesn't mean you won't be meeting. So it isn't, I'm trying to think how to say it. There isn't a clean predefined answer at this stage of the game. And the vision was to have conversations with IRST, to meet with IRST periodically.
And one other quick follow-up, just making sure nobody else has theirs up. And I can't see Jason, so I'm not sure if he's got his hand up or not, but related to budget needs, how does this schedule align with, long session, when budgets actually come out, when those get approved? Has this been coordinated with that?
Yeah. So it has, and in rule, there's the research agenda that goes to the board is actually timed with the budget coming from the legislature. So the first time, we need that initial legislatively determined budget. So hopefully, knock on wood, that'll happen, by the close of this session. And then the collective we will have a better understanding of what the budget we're working with is. And we've got the governor's recommended budget. And so that's what we're planning for right now. And hopefully the legislature will do at least that good. And so then the cycle is in July of odd years. So just after it's been renewed, after the budget has been renewed and maybe modulated a little bit up or down, will be when you folks will be making decisions on the research agenda and moving that forward with the board. And then there's also a little complication in the sense that INR is doing most of the work for IRST, so they will be receiving the funds to cover the contracts through the RFPs, and they'll be able to carry funds over year to year. And so we're going to have a way to track all that and make it easy to understand. And I've seen what they do in Washington with their first equivalent, which is called CEMER, and Adrian has experience with them, and perhaps others of you here do as well. But they've got a nice way of tracking progress on different projects and funding, that type of thing. So hopefully I answer your question.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm sure I'll have more questions, but I don't want to steal Adrian's thunder. So happy to have him chat with us now.
Perfect segue, Amanda. Thank you. Just super quick before we go to you, Adrian, I just wanted to echo, Seth, what you said. We asked Terry to kind of frame up and provide some context about what's the longer timeline we're looking at, some of the budget realities that we're thinking about. But just for clarity, the statutory deadline is this August for this group to identify the research topic. So we have a little bit of time. We could potentially make a decision today. Otherwise, probably looking at the June meeting for where we would be deciding. And Adrian will, I think, speak to kind of some of the context to the three required topics that are in statute and how it got there through the PFA process. But just put a little framing around, we already have three that we need to look at. Does it make sense to develop a process for additional ones? What does that look like? So before we kind of get to that, I just wanted to set up that framing. And with that, Adrian, maybe you want to jump in and speak a little bit about EGOs and the research topics that are in statute.
Absolutely. So no, that was a helpful framing, Terry, and I think you'll you'll find both sort of the process step timelines, and then as we move into research implementation, those timelines become really important, because you're going to have, multi-year projects overlapping with different processes, and it gets complicated in a hurry. But you sort of build and then eat the elephant one bite at a time. So with respect to kind of, I thought about, and kind of maybe I'd start with the Eastern Oregon slopes literature review. I guess before I go into specifics, I'd say broadly, these three topics were areas that were important to someone during the negotiations. And they weren't things that we could, sort of resolve in the actual negotiations themselves. And while we used it judiciously, we did use the adaptive management program as a bit of a parking lot to be able to make progress on certain issues. We didn't want to dump everything to be determined, but there were some things that either out of necessity or out of just the nature of the negotiations is how they arrived there. So that's how these things got here. I wanted to start with Eastern Oregon slopes because I think it pertains quite well to the conversation you just had. It's a lit review, right? And it I imagine can be, go through this process. In fact, I would argue it's a good one to start with because it's easy to kind of run through it. And I think you'll see how the timelines actually work in practice for something that's a bit of a light lift. But I think it's pretty straightforward, in terms of what it is. And it's, I think will be pretty easy to do an RFP for, pretty easy to contract. So I think that's going to be a good one to just, test the system as you're building it. In sort of increasing in complexity, we move into kind of the roads component. And in that case, there's a little more specific direction. This is research, but it's basically saying, do the kind of research, and there's a couple of citations in the group. I think it's Dubé et al. and Martin et al. There are a couple studies that looked at various aspects of how rules impact sedimentation from roads. And here, where I say it's going to be a little bit more nuanced now, because this isn't just a literature review. You've got actually direction to go do a study, but it's somewhat framed. But I would expect, knowing the context around this, there's going to be a strong interest in researching the effectiveness of this rules on, what we refer to as sort of the hydrological disconnection of the roadway. That was a big component of the negotiations. The rules are, designed to minimize that in various levels. And this is where I think the AMC needs to begin to really think about how you want to direct the IRST. You could simply say, do what Kathy Dubé did, right? It's a good study. It's the same stuff we want to know. Go implement it. Could be as simple as that. You would be, I agree, consistent with the legislation if you were to do that. That might be too much, though. Or maybe there's some things, they looked at that aren't as relevant to what you want to look at. But you've got some framework, but you're going to have to provide the IRST with some policy direction around what components of the road rules do you want them to look at. And the rules sort of provide that sort of, and again, Terry did a good job of sort of laying those out, sort of what that back and forth looks like, so that you can make informed recommendations and they can receive them in a way that's actually implementable. So that's going to be a good one. Things to be thinking about that I would flag is that you've got, for a project like this, you might have a monitoring period in year 2 and another one in year 6 and another one in year 10. I'm just making this up. You could have a very long study is what I wanted to make, or you could have a short one. And again, budget and, kind of the urgency of results from your perspective as the policy body are all things that you're going to be weighing in on. IRST can come up with a Cadillac study. It's going to cost $10 billion and take 40 years, and you're going to get everything answered. but that's probably not going to work for a policy context for this group. So that's really, your job there is to try to hone that in. The third one that's sort of up there is probably the toughest one. And that is sort of the amphibians. And if you read the PFA, there's some very vague direction around this priority, and how I've characterized it, to Terry and to Sean, was like, this is something that would benefit from actually developing a study plan, right? It's not like we're going out looking at, hydrologic connectivity. That's a very, specific thing to go look at. Amphibians is broad, which amphibians? Do you want to prioritize one over the other? How much does this cost to do? All of these questions, I think, would benefit from coming up with a study plan. Maybe that starts out with a lit review or a systematics evidence review, and then comes back, and then you make a decision. But that's ultimately what you guys get to decide, is how you want to do that. How deep do you want to go? How much do you want to know? And you're all going to bring perspectives to that. So I'll pause there before I sort of transition into sort of the BGO conversation. But that sort of gives you at least a little bit of context of what was set up in the PFA for those three topic areas and how it relates kind of to this conversation. But I'll pause there if there's questions before I get into the kind of how the BGOs slide into this.
So Julie and then Josh.
Yep, we'll see if it's the same question or not. So, wanting to honor the deliberations that went before, it would be really helpful to understand a little bit about what the debate was about amphibians, or what the special concern was there.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I would say that if I were to try to summarize this and trying to think back, I would say it was characterized around two different approaches on uncertainty, right? And this is sort of that classic, right? We don't know a lot about them and how they interact with, forest management broadly. And so the question then becomes, how do you move forward with that uncertainty? And, kind of as the policymakers crafting this deal, we agreed to not include a covered species, a potential covered species. So there's actually an amphibian that is not going to be covered by the pending habitat conservation plan, because we couldn't agree around that level of uncertainty for that particular species where everybody was comfortable. These ones made it in. And I would say it's probably a difference, the tensions around sort of like whether do you jump in and do experimental studies, right? Do you actually test the effects of these prescriptions on amphibians? I expect folks that might want to do that in the policy conversations that we were having. And there were folks who were saying, before we go do all of that, let's see where they are, because this isn't a species that's well understood. And so I think there's going to be examples of sort of, if your ultimate goal is sort of to understand what the impacts are of this set of prescriptions on amphibians, and we don't know a lot about amphibians, where do we start? Well, you guys got to make this decision, but my opinion would be start figuring out where they are and know where they are first. And once you have a better understanding of the distribution of the species, then you can start to look at how you might actually evaluate the effectiveness of the prescriptions on those species and their life cycle. So I'm obviously not an amphibians expert, and it was painful for the poor people who were to have to deal with me during the negotiations, but hopefully that gave you a little bit of flavor. Stacy, you were part of this. Did I represent that fairly?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think there are a lot of questions around uncertainty, the science that's out there. There's different opinions about that science. And so I think the placement of amphibians in the sort of broad context for the AMP-C really reflects that in a lot of ways. And, even thinking about the road section and the standards we did develop, the uncertainty around, how that affects amphibians, what we kind of landed on. And so I think there's definitely ways that this group could narrow in on some of those key uncertainty or less certain areas.
If I could jump in, because I was gonna address that same sort of thing. This is an area where I think it's fortuitous that we've got both the scientists from the two sides that were involved in here in the negotiations as part of the IRST. And I could foresee us having an AMC meeting where if we wanted to discuss amphibians, for example, we might invite Jeff and Kelly to join us for part of that discussion and just talk to us about their understanding and their perspectives in the conversation. And then we could jump off of that and have a discussion here, right? So I think there's some opportunity there.
Hi, Adrian. This is Josh, Seeds DEQ. I'm back. How's it going? So there was, you had these three topics that were parking lotted to the AMC. And there was a couple others that are just going to rulemaking, tethered logging and post-disturbance logging. So that's kind of like 5 areas where there was no agreement reached, or the agreements had, a lot of disagreement or controversy or uncertainty. Were there other topic areas that you would also queue up as having, in addition to those 3 that are mandated in the statute?
That's a good question. I mean, I would bifurcate those a little bit with that we've got sort of the AMP-C 3 and then the ones that sort of get fast tracked in terms of tethered logging and I already forgot the other one. Post disturbance logging. Those really, I would say we just ran out of time in terms of being able to actually come to an agreement. And I think folks felt comfortable enough that we would get there, that we would do that outside of the adaptive management program so that those don't have to wait to go through these process steps. So that's sort of a distinction between those 2 and the 3 we're talking about here. In terms of other topics, yeah, there were a lot. I don't know if I could give you a list off the top of my head, but I would say that, with respect to, I'll back up. A lot of the agreements were reached in compromise. Hey, I really need this to get us to yes on this issue. Somebody else needed this, and there was a compromise. I think it's assumed that, within that giant soup of the negotiations, there are things other than these 3 that will rise to the top in terms of attention. I think folks are going to bring that from your perspectives around the table. Your agency's perspective is going to be important in that conversation. Other representatives here. The other thing to not forget is the board, right? This is, you will self-generate research priorities, but the board can also dictate it. So could the legislature, so could the courts. That's very unlikely, I think, if we did this right. But those are ways that things could find them to your table. I'll give that some thought about kind of what other hot topics were. I really have to kind of go back through and see which ones really sort of translated to sort of more scientific uncertainty versus just a policy position. Most of them were policy positions. So it wasn't a great answer, Josh, but that's what I got.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah. For me, I'm kind of like, what was everyone hung up on at 12 a.m. on the last day, you know, those kind of hot topics. Why was everyone, while I was asleep, why were you guys still awake?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, honestly, if you want to be that specific, nothing that would ever see the adaptive management light of day. Is much more, oh, just sort of the rule nuances. The
Yeah.
mitigation program came out of that, as an
All right.
example of something.
Thank you, Adrian.
Just a quick thing, I would echo the need, I think, or the importance of getting appropriate speakers in to educate us all about at least these three issues, because, you know, they're so diverse, you know, and their knowledge base of what you need everywhere from, you know, geomorphology to amphibian and herpetology. And so it would be helpful to do that and to also help set the context of which ones require, for example, is there a triaging that has to be done here? You know, are some answers needed to be found out quicker than others? And if so, which ones would those be?
That's a great point. That's, I think, a super important point, is that you know, you may have a near-term need and a long-term need, and understanding that, you know, a piece of a study could go forward sooner rather than later, I think is a really important nuance to tease out. The IRST is not formally convened yet, correct?
That's right.
Okay. I was thinking about that and not knowing how they're going to set it up, but I'll say, based on that other model up north, you're going to have some level of leadership within the IRST. And it's probably not unlike what you've set up with your own charter. Something will need to be done there. A co-chair model is a good model that I like, so good job to you. If something similar to that would happen, I could see the actual co-chairs being, you know, that interface between the IRST and yourselves. And then I think certainly they could draw on subject matter experts. You know, if you needed a seminar on kind of the state of the knowledge of salamanders or the covered species, just so you could get your grasp on it, that might be a useful thing to do. But yeah, it is tough to sort of start out. I think, again, once this thing gets rolling and the cadence gets established, you're going to get, you know, reports back that are going to lead to a sharpening of the pencils on questions. You know, those systematic literature reviews, I think, would be a good tool to use, in particular if you're sort of branching out on a sort of a new topic area that's maybe, you know, not fully developed for the kind of regulatory process we have just set up. Others, you may know exactly the question you need to answer, and you can go jump right to the research. It really will depend on that policy question. You know, I could pick on tethered logging, even though I said it's a separate sort of policy driver. But if you knew that the issue around tethered logging was solely soil compaction, I'm just making that up, right? And this was in scope for this group, and that's where the concerns were, and everybody was worried about it from a policy perspective. Well, you could be pretty specific to the IRST. It says we need a study to evaluate the impacts of tethered logging on soil compaction. And that's simple. If you don't know that, you've got to get some information before you can form that kind of specific recommendation.
Maybe just to add on to your question, Dave, and what you were saying, Adrian, maybe this is where you were going, Seth, but we had some conversations with Terry about maybe using some of our upcoming meetings to really focus on those core topics that we know we're going to need to look at. And so that was part of our idea with this field trip, maybe focusing our next meeting on forest roads and kind of digging into that, inviting some folks to come and speak to that. So
Like some experts on forest roads.
Some experts on forest roads, maybe some folks involved in the Seymour, Washington study that could kind of speak to how they developed their research question. But really trying to, we're all kind of getting up to speed on some of these topics and figuring out who the right speakers are to bring in. So just throwing that out there as an idea for more discussion.
Sure, I'll go. I think part of this, what you're getting to, Dave, is and what we've been sort of touching on a little bit here that we haven't established yet is that IRST. And once we get that IRST, it's the other arm, the science arm of this, right? This body doesn't need to come up with the exact question. That's that interaction with the IRST that will help us hone in on the question that we're really after. And I think that's maybe the piece that's harder for us to envision in this group, because we're not the researchers, right? But that's why we have that side. And I love your idea, Adrian, about even if on a topic as broadly as amphibians, right? Where we don't have specifics about what we should be looking at with amphibians. It's just like, go look at amphibia, consider amphibians. It's like, that's as ripe to me for an opportunity for like a symposium of some sort where we work with the IRST. The IRST helps develop some sort of a number of researchers to come in. We could attend that. IRST members could attend that. Even board of forestry members potentially could attend that. And then out of that, we have a discussion afterwards and talk about what do we think? What do people take away from it? What are our priorities? But I think that the IRST will be like super helpful in helping us hone in on the actual science that we're prioritizing.
Amanda?
So I'm just looking at the kind of schedule of events here and the process that Terry laid forward. And I know that the IRST is supposed to develop like a lay report on the findings, right? Based on the questions. And I guess as far as the folks that I represent in this conversation, there's sort of what the science says, or, sort of, I don't want to say in a vacuum, but there's kind of the scientific literature, and then there's how that gets implemented and like the realities of the technology that we have and the workforce that we have and all these other things, right? Associated with, okay, what's actually doable to, like, how do we actually utilize that science in practice? And I'm just wondering kind of where that fits in, or if there's an intent, or if there was conversations in the negotiations about having questions around that associated with kind of these larger questions.
Yeah, so I would say that's squarely at this table. I mean, you did a good job sort of bifurcating the sort of like, we have a question, go answer it, you get the answer back, and the process is designed where that report comes to two places. It comes to you all at this table, and it goes directly to the board. And that was intentional. Our hope is that this body will be the deliberative body that comes up with a recommendation in response to that science. Oftentimes I expect it will be, that's interesting, we confirmed what we thought, and there may be no action. I would say in sort of, there's also a likelihood that, this is my favorite one, that one set of questions leads to another set of questions. So there could be, a recommendation to do further science in this path. And then I think the other outcome is a regulatory change, right? And that's where it's going to be hard. But I think this body will be looking and weighing exactly what you described, Amanda, is sort of like, okay, what can we do here to meet all of the objectives that we've got around this table in response to this science? And that, you'll be sort of, not rehashing, but, following a lot of the process that was part of the PFA negotiations, whereas, we've got this new information now. We need to address it. How do we do that? What's the right policy mechanism? Whether that's a buffer change, whether that's, I don't know, a prescription change on a road. I mean, it really is sort of hard to do hypotheticals because it's going to be all of it. But you're gonna be in the position to sort of do those sort of cost benefit analyses and try to come up with something that folks are comfortable supporting. If the system works well, then you got consensus recommendations or near consensus recommendations to the board. And there's processes for when that doesn't happen too. But that's where that piece of it is really happening in this table after you get that report back.
Okay, thank you for explaining that.
So
Do you
go
wanna-
ahead, Stacy.
I was
Yeah, I
gonna
was-
say, do you want to talk about PGOs a
Yeah.
little bit?
So this is a fun one because it is a little challenging because they're coming, but they're not here yet. There's a draft. It probably won't change a lot, but it might. There's a lot of space here. So I'm gonna give sort of, take it for what it's worth. It's advice. I have my own biases and interests, so there's that. But you've got three things in front of you right now. One's pretty easy, one's sort of easy, and one's pretty hard in terms of establishing kind of getting the research kicked off and going. All three of those, under any imagined scenario of biological goals and objectives, this research is going to support those. So you could write your own, and odds are this research will support those biological goals and objectives. So as we move forward, there's going to be interests, and I'll pick on Josh a little bit. One of the things that popped into my mind during the conversation was water quantity, right? That was something we did not get agreement on in the PFA in terms of how or if we were going to address that. You'll hear a bunch of different opinions around that area, and there's arguably a wide variety of research, but that's probably not, I would argue, settled science. So that may be of interest to DEQ. It's not really part of the forest practices specifically, but it's certainly related. And that is something I could fully see coming to this table and kind of wrestling with in terms of how we're going to prioritize that relative to other things. Somebody else is going to care about something else, right? And they're going to say, we need to answer this uncertainty because you made assumptions in your biological goals and objectives based on this, and we think we need to form that up. And that's all going to come to this table. and I guess what I really wanted to emphasize here is that, you're really limited by what you can arrive on in terms of agreement and your budget. And ultimately, from my experience up north, once you have a firm understanding of the budget, once you've got your first set of studies laid out there, you're going to look and say, okay, we've got time to insert things here, and we have this amount of money. And three people have raised their hands and said, I'm interested in exploring X and Y and Z. You'll have to have that deliberation. And oftentimes the money available to answer, maybe it's not the highest priority question, but you can get it done for the money you've got for that year. You're going to prioritize that one. Something that might be more important and more expensive, I shouldn't say more important, but something that's more expensive might get pushed out till after that last road field season is done so that you have budget capacity for it. And that's where, this scheduling tool becomes really, really important, because you're going to have studies that are, going to take years, and in some cases years, to actually get the results. You're going to have multiple measurement periods, for example, and you're going to have on years and off years. You're just going to have to stagger those. And Terry's going to be dealing with a lot of the mechanics of that. But as you make decisions, that's going to be informed on, okay, 3 years ago, we agreed to this study plan, and those field studies are all happening in 2024. Or I guess I have to go further out, 2020, let's say 2025. And you've got $100,000 left. Well, you're probably not going to add something in 2025, but you might want to, you might have something small you could do, or you could simply push it on to 2026. So again, timing and budget are probably going to create a framework for you, and you're just going to have to manage those priorities as they come. But I suspect some will be self-generated here. I suspect you'll get a few from the board from time to time. And I think you'll get some that sort of come back to you I think the amphibians is going to be a great example, right? You're going to go do some amount of pre-work, and that's going to say, okay, given time and money, maybe we don't do this, but we do that. And those are how that's going to play out. But eventually you will have the BGOs. The other thing I should highlight in this space is that the board can use this forum for things, I'll say, unrelated to the covered species. We allowed that opportunity. There's a yes, but, and I think this will be the body that will deliver that yes, but. It can't impact the overarching, I would say there's probably real words here, but you can't get distracted with something with feathers at the expense of something with scales, right? This program has to support the HCP. It has to support the biological goals and objectives. It has to support kind of the water rules, for lack of a better word. Now, if there's extra money from the legislature or the board allocates additional resources from ODF to address a literature review for, pick your feathered friend, and they want to use this body and organizational structure to do that work, they can do it. It just can't become a distraction from the main core of the program. So that's another thing that you might find in your table. I honestly, I should speculate as to whether or not that will happen, but it will be interesting to see. Maybe I'll conclude by simply saying, I don't think this group really needs to worry about what the BGOs will be. I think you can rest assured that, the first round of research projects will be in support of those. And then really it's up to you all to kind of go through that exercise from your different perspectives. And if you're like, man, I think it's, ODF has never answered this one question that I've been thinking about for years and years and years, get it on the table. I mean, that's what this body is for. And to have that conversation and talk about it. Others agree it's a priority. Do you have the money? Go do it. I'll be there with water temperature later, but I'll give you some time.
Any questions online for Adrian? I guess I'm curious, Adrian, or others who have familiarity with Washington, is there a process through which new research topics kind of get on that list?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So somebody referenced sort of the cadence to the budget process. It would be at that point. So when you're deciding the budget in historically in Washington, it comes down to, I wasn't around when they sort of launched it, so I don't have real good advice or insight in terms of kind of where you're at in the process. But you're going to know what money you spent last year, what you're not going to spend that year, and you're going to know what your proposed budget for the following biennium is, and you're going to have a list of projects that are in various stages, and they're going to have dollars attached to it, and you're going to have a pot of money at the end of that. And people will have brought research topics and ideas to the table before. In Washington, they put them on a list, and they're I would say routinely prioritized year after year. Some continually fall to the bottom because something else comes in over the top. Sometimes they slip in, but it's at that budgeting process where you know how much capacity you have and you kind of know where interests are, and then it's the groups makes that decision, but it's budget driven in terms of process, I should say.
Casey?
Yeah, thank you. This is Casey. Going, kind of returning to the biological goals and objectives, even with the three, effectiveness and monitoring of roads and the east side steep slopes logging and the amphibians, it does seem like you could do that research or deliver that research agenda to IRST and not have it in any way be connected to the BGOs just by virtue of not being specific about it. So it does seem like at some point in the process, you do need to connect the research question, however big or small, to a BGO or several. Or sorry, I should say to 2 or more objectives or 1 or more objectives, right? That it's not just, this is a research question that we think is really awesome, but it's because of this part of the BGO chapter, for example.
Yeah, I don't see, I think, yeah, there's different ways to kind of get at that. But I think ultimately I would agree with you. You certainly can connect. There are also things in this sort of regulatory space that people might be interested that are not connected to the biological goals and objectives. And so I think the balance here is doing enough work to support, eventually the HCP and be able to demonstrate that we're meeting those biological goals and objectives. And that should be a priority for this group, but it's not meant to exclude things that might not be in those biological goals and objectives, i.e. my water quantity example is a very real world one of those. It's not saying you can't look at that. It's just that's not specifically, at least right now, not called out in the biological goals and objectives. Does that make sense? Because I don't want to imply that everything has to connect to it, because that would then limit the work that you would do, and the intent wasn't to limit it. But certainly you definitely would want to connect the dots with your research if they do support the biological goals and objectives. That's absolutely true. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
And let me just, I would rephrase it just a little bit, Adrian. Yes, they can go outside of doing things that are BGOs, but it can't relate to BGOs, but it can't get in the way. You said it earlier, can't get in the way of doing research related to BGOs. So something like water quality technically could be done, but it can't be done at the expense of things of the research related to BGO.
Right. That's always true. And it's probably better to use something more disconnected, so, if we spent all of the AMC money budget on, murrelet research, that would not be okay. Right. But if we wanted to look at something, they wanted to use this process for a very discrete ask, and they brought funding, and they just wanted to use the administrative apparatus to get it contracted and get the work done, because people felt that this group, the grouping of stakeholders would yield a better policy outcome. That's probably an example of something that would go there. But there's going to be stuff that's gray and in between, and that people are going to want to study. But again, I don't think you want to use, the AMC exists to support the regulatory structure. It also exists to serve the overarching HCP to come. It does double duty. And so, one has, I would say, priority over the others. But again, I'm trying to speak for Sean here. The intent here isn't to exclude other interests, other policy interests from utilizing this program.
Yeah. So I hope that this question doesn't make people mad, but I feel comfortable enough to ask it in this context. So, adaptive management can go one of two ways, right? It might make us realize we need to do more protections, or we might realize that we have protections that are over and above what's actually necessary. So was there any discussion in the negotiations about how questions should be framed, or kind of the mix of questions that go kind of one way or the other to determine, are we protecting too much or protecting
You're
not
giving
enough?
us way too much credit, Amanda. The short
Welcome,
answer
Adrian.
is no. But I think it's an important point. I mean, that is a policy question. Uncertainty cuts both ways, right? So you'll have interests around this group to say, I think 110-foot buffer on whatever fish stream is like way too much. I know there's people who desperately want to thin those buffers, both for timber production as well as to accelerate the growth of a riparian area. So a couple of real world examples, right? With the money and time that you have, could you do an experiment that would actually look at a specific set of prescriptions and their impacts to the resource, whether it be water temperature, whether it be the fish itself, and you wanted to do that? yes, you could. There's nothing to prohibit it from happening. But I would say, generally speaking, from my experience in Washington and just the sort of tenor of the negotiations, the uncertainty is usually driven more towards the covered species than the economic side. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's kind of how the negotiation shaped out. But there's nothing to preclude a manipulative study that might look at a totally different way of doing buffers, right? Maybe you do some variable width buffers. You're not doing this, in the middle of COVID. You're doing this over the next, several decades. You've got time to be able to have these deliberations, these conversations, and think through the value proposition for both, the industry as well as for the species, and how you would approach that. We went for dark and dumb, right? It's easy to implement. We could get agreement on it, and we moved on. This body has got more time and more resources to think through those kinds of questions. Was that an okay answer? And I don't think you made anybody mad.
Yeah,
So it's a totally fair question.
Yeah, and I don't think that it has to be framed from an economic perspective. I think there's a lot of ecological questions that, there's differing science around and differing opinion and policy around, whether or not, like you mentioned, I think that the specific examples are very, those are things that we talk about all the time, right? And there's definitely two or more schools of thought on kind of where things land. And so like I said, since I wasn't in the room, I don't know how these negotiations happened and how this program got developed and kind of what that looked like. And I'm not super familiar with SEMR, so I don't really have that context. Just, thinking about how we can have one topic or one big question with multiple sub questions that might provide us or give us the ability to come at things from multiple perspectives, right? Because anytime a scientific question is asked, right, there's always some implicit bias or unconscious bias that kind of goes into that. So if we recognize that and see that there's an opportunity to maybe come from multiple perspectives and then get a really robust report from that, I think that that's, I would hope that that's something that we consider moving forward, but just wasn't sure if that was a part of the conversation. So sorry, or maybe, you're welcome for giving you more credit than you may feel like you're doing.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely, oh, sorry, Terry, just real quick, it reflects that, the list of 3 are those places where I think one side felt maybe there could be more, one side felt that probably there could be less. And one question I have, just in sort of moving this discussion along, is thinking about our process. If we want to develop a process for adding new items on. And so it's helpful to get Adrian's context about, in Washington, it's really tied to the budget process. I could definitely see some value in this group taking some time. If we feel comfortable, we have those first 3, if those feel pretty solid, really using this time now to think through, like, what does our process look like for adding new research topics? So I guess maybe 2 questions for the group are, is there something else missing right now that we think makes sense to add? Do folks feel really strongly that these 3 we have to do? And what are the other 1 to however many we could do at the beginning? And then do we want to spend some time on really developing a process to think through those? So Terry, that was a nice segue, but you want to jump in?
I'm gonna just hold, it's going in the weeds. I don't think it helps this discussion.
I'll just share my perspective is that these 3 are put out there. They are in statute or in rule and statute, frankly, also kind of prefaced in the bill as sort of the ones to get started. And so from my perspective, there is a lot of sub questions that could be asked in those 3 very large topics. And so sort of, and I'll just say from my perspective, I say we leave those 3. And when we start moving with those 3, I like your idea of coming up with a process for how and when do we evaluate to see if more need to be added down the road. I think that's valid and a good way to go, but I think we have some pretty, we could maybe, move us into the next phase of thinking about that just by making a motion and formally adopting those three as the three that we're moving forward with, and then we can start a conversation about how we, amend or add or whatever moving forward, but that would get us to satisfying that deadline in a pretty way that's already been prepared for us. That's my thought.
Get it in there. That sounds great. I'm happy to make a motion to that end. I was reflecting on another committee that I sit on, actually with Josh and a couple other people here. And the value of being able to do those sub questions that aren't necessarily related to the BGOs, but that we know either regulatorily or within our organizations, we want to have answered. So making sure that there are those sub questions that aren't just BGO related. And then I appreciate that we do need to have a process, and I can imagine kind of how it might happen to add more questions. But with that, I'd be happy to make a motion, but I also want to respect another card raise.
Well, I have a couple of things. One, I have a question probably for Adrian, and then I'm not ready for a motion. I'd like to have more discussion before we're making a motion on what our initial research topics are.
Okay.
I think we need more time on that one. Just my thought. Adrian, a clarification of the three east side landslide prone areas, amphibians, and then the roads piece. My reading of the language on the roads piece is it's really about a study design, asking IRST to come up with a study design for evaluating the road rules. Am I reading that correctly? Is this specifically a study design question to look at BMP adequacy?
I would say yes off the cuff, with the caveat that I should pull it up and look myself. And Stacy, you and I both were pretty close to this, so you might be able to bail me out a little bit here. But I think what at least some folks are hoping comes out of this is confidence that what we negotiated is indeed working. And I highlighted this earlier, specifically the implementation of BMPs that hydrologically disconnect roads specifically is something, as we talked about, those sort of subcategories. So those two studies that are referenced do that, right? They definitely check that box in terms of the kind of work that would need to be done. So yes, a study designed to at least address hydrologic disconnect. However, it doesn't bind you, right? Those of you who have done sort of managed research budgets, a lot of the money is spent putting the human in the car to get to the woods to do the measurements. Once you're there, gathering data, I'll say, is relatively cheap. You need time to analyze it, but the real cost function is the human getting out there and doing the work. So to the extent, if you want to take a very sort of narrow approach, I would surmise that you will have agreement around this table that at a minimum, a study that looks at hydrologic disconnection over time and the effectiveness of that is going to get enthusiastically supported, right? And then the question becomes, what else? What else in the road space is important to this group? Kind of, Amanda got me thinking, there's what do we argue over? Soil placement on something, right? There's like spoils being placed outside of the RMA was really important. Yeah, right. And so I don't know, I'm making this up just as an example, but there was a compromise in that case made to, just essentially moving dirt away from the stream if you have to store it long term. Could you design a study that actually looks at whether or not that's necessary? Sure, you could do that. Does it make sense to do that with this study? Maybe. Maybe a better example would be, it's got hydrologic disconnect is probably the big one. Trying to think maybe there's something to do with fish passage because you're going to be at the culvert, right? Again, I'm not saying these are good or bad ideas. It's just things that you should be thinking about in terms of what is important in terms of understanding these forest practice rules effectiveness on the landscape. You know, my sense is, you know, on fish passage, pretty well understood. There may be some elements, but maybe I'm wrong. Not a fish biologist.
Yeah, just to add to that, Adrian, I think the hydrologic disconnection thread is really throughout the changes to the forest road section. And so that was a big intent and really looking at is it Martin and Dubé, those studies
Yep.
as potential examples, you know, seeing what Washington was able to do and can we learn from that here and really get some immediate or relatively immediate answers on how we met that bar with the changes that we made. But also to your point, Adrian, that it could be more expansive than that. That was just sort of the intention coming out of that, so not an adaptive management, but there are a number of things that I would add to that list, you know, that we had a lot of conversation about. Maybe there's some less certainty around, so those sub questions will be important too.
So for a few seconds, flashed on the board was the possible motion that we might be looking forward to. And I don't know where Josh was going with his request, but I'd sort of like to see us break that motion into 3 separate motions. Because I think we can move, I would feel very comfortable about moving one of those questions, the eastern slopes literature review, very comfortable about wanting to move that one forward and getting it forward. And so the RST can meet the first time they've got work in front of them that they can start to work on. But I'm not sure that I'm knowledgeable enough yet to do other than sit here and absorb if we wanted to go beyond that question. So I don't know where you were going, Casey, but I don't know where you were, but personally, I think there needs to be more, the questions that need to be wrapped into the question of number 2 and 3, I think are huge. So
Just to keep in mind, there's a difference between research topics and research questions. So the research topic is the broad picture.
Thank you.
And the research question is diving into what is our real research, what do we want to research specifically about this topic? So rule says these 3 topics are priorities. It's a question if you want to add other big broad ones. So the question at this stage of the game, it's what are the big broad things we want to think about, as opposed to we're interested in researching this particular question. So just to help disambiguate those 2.
Steve, and correct me if I'm wrong, I should have brought my rule book with me, but the rules themselves actually require, I believe they require a literature review any of each one. So that, and the idea was that should inform your sub questions.
Yes.
Right? That'll help you sort of hone in on what's missing, what are the gaps, and then how do we figure that out?
Given that we have this August deadline and we need to decide on these big topics, we don't need to decide on the questions yet. We still have more time. What other information do folks need? You know, we could make a decision today. We could make a decision at our next meeting in June. Is there additional information or questions, or what would set us up well? We don't make a decision today, but then we would be able to do that for the June meeting.
Just my suggestion, maybe I'm just being involved in some of our things in the past, as has been alluded to already. I mean, all we have here are topics. It'd be good to get, and I asked for this, you know, from Terry a while back, and, you know, we're kind of ferreting it out, but what are the I mean, you know, you got questions based on, I see something, I want to figure out what it is. I want to propose an experiment and test it. Okay, but what I would like to know, okay, what manifested bringing up these topics in the first place? I mean, for example, with amphibians, is it they're, you know, amphibians are declining because, and then you know, hypothesize what it is or whatever it is about the roads. So it'd be nice to get a little bit more definition on what those actual questions are within these topics, so that way, you know, obviously we're not experts, but we can, I mean, a lot of this is common sense. And so we could help focus and train our minds toward that end, and then help develop, you know, a better plan going forward. I mean, that's how science works pretty much. My training.
Josh and then Casey.
Yeah, so to me, there's kind of a couple things I'm mulling over, and one is the east side landslide prone areas, that's pretty straightforward. That's already prescribed. The roads piece, to me, having spent an inordinate amount of time looking at, thinking about forest roads and so on, that one seems pretty straightforward to me. It's design of a monitoring program for the road rules. Amphibians is too broad for me to like say, oh yeah, I'm comfortable voting on amphibians. I think for amphibians, we need to spend a little time as an AMC, like, what about amphibians, like amphibian habitat? Effect of, you know, EMPs on amphibians. And then that kind of starts getting, and what about silvicultural practices? If a small woodlands person is doing primarily uneven aged or long rotation management, is there a difference between that and, you know, with the same RELZ setup, is there a difference based on what kind of specific kind of silviculture is happening in the adjacent uplands and within that riparian, the RELZ specifically for up. So I think I would like to spend some time taking down amphibians into topic areas within amphibians. And then from what I know, based on where I got the most questions from interested parties during the PFA negotiations, I think probably there was a lot of back and forth and disagreement on west side landslide prone areas, and then riparian in general, but specifically riparian on non-fish streams. How are those important or not for downstream water quality and habitat on the fish bearing streams, in addition to are they important or how are they important for amphibians? So in addition to those three, but very closely related to, we've got a west side LPA rule. So that's not a short-term thing to test that. And given the way landslide prone areas function on the west side and how they're triggered by extreme rainfall and so on, that's actually the only way to answer that is as a long-term topic, but you have to get your monitoring set up in place and ready to go. And then same thing with the non-fish, the end streams. We've got a piece in place similar to the roads, I guess, is in my thinking. We do want to test that because that's so important for water quality and habitat quality and generation over time. So in addition to wanting to look at the amphibians, I want to at least consider as an MC, how do we approach the adequacy of BMPs? And being a water quality person, I'm going to focus in on west side landslide prone areas and type in, you know, non-fish streams in general. So I'd like to have some discussion on those. So Will's idea of breaking it down into like individual motions might like be one way to go about that. Because like I said, I'm really ready to go on east side LPAs. I'm ready to go on the roads piece. The amphibians I want to work some more on, and I have some other topic ideas. And, you know, I'm even really interested in the idea of what's the impact? Is there an impact of different silviculture practices in the uplands? There's been a lot of discussion about long rotation, even aged forestry with, you know, commercial thinning in there. There's a lot of discussion about how uneven aged forestry works on the east side and the west side. That, you know, different silvicultural approaches might be too much for an initial set, but, you know, I'd like to consider broadening out. I think we definitely need the three, of course, that are in statute, but yeah, I'd like to have some discussion.
Okay.
So this is, I'm gonna interrupt real quick and just say thank you. This is like so cool to watch this actually happen. But what Josh just did is sort of lay out some interests, right? You know, he just came to the table and said, hey, these are some things that I'm interested in from an agency perspective. I've got this mandate. This is what I'd like to see this program be evaluating. These are areas of uncertainty with respect to my agency. He's got to sell it now, right? You know, we got to, as a group, look at it as a budget. Somebody else is going to come in with something else. Somebody else is going to come in with something else. And you're going to have to kind of figure out how to accommodate all of those interests, but get it on the table. I mean, that's a big part of it. So thank you for kind of breaking the ice there. That was cool to watch. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I totally meant to interrupt.
Thank you, Adrian.
And maybe that's a clarification, sorry, real quick, Casey. So we need to identify these 3 by August, but does that preclude us from adding additional ones after that? Or, I mean, are those 3 then set for, because that may give us a little more flexibility too.
I mean, you guys can handcuff yourselves to a certain degree in terms of your own process. I mean, that's a conversation of how strict you want to be in terms of the timing. I think the practical nature of this is you want to hit that budget prioritization threshold. There's nothing to keep you from keeping a running list of people's interests, right? And people can raise it. It's a good way for people to remember, oh yeah, this was an issue that somebody raised a while ago that we didn't explore. Well, now is about the right time to do that in terms of time and money. You can resurface those things. And, you know, that other state I work in, it's sort of you're below the line or above the line. If you're above the line, you're funded, you're in the schedule. If you're below the line, you've at least been sort of scoped out, kind of like what you're talking about. What would it take to do this? You know, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, we agreed to these 3 and we want to do at least a literature review on X, or we at least like to scope out what would a research project to do X, Y, or Z cost. I mean, those are sort of small asks that don't really have a budget consequence in terms of applied research, but you could direct the IRST to bring back information so that you could form a more thoughtful opinion.
Casey and then Amanda?
Great. So I wanted to just piggyback on both Commissioner Tucker, sorry, and Josh, with just the note that the rules taking us back. It says by August, I mean, everybody knows this, but by August 1st of 2023, the AMC shall complete the charter, develop the initial list of research topics, including the priorities in OAR, blah, blah, blah. And it says following completion of this list, going back to the process, the AMC shall integrate the list into a research agenda. And then it says, this is what that research agenda should look like, which is really developing the preliminary research questions, including the type of research and monitoring, the rule, biological goals and objectives, and other issues being studied. So that's like BGOs plus maybe other things. A brief description of the context of the research question and the objective of the research. This is the agenda. This is what we do when we develop the agenda, and other information the AMC deems necessary for IRST, or Independent Research and Science Team work, to begin. And so I think that specifically, because you were talking about you feel comfortable with sea slopes and the road rules, as it were.
Yeah.
The question of amphibians is one that I actually see those upper stream buffers being a very important part of the research question around amphibians, because I have my own knowledge, but the PFA report says, hey, this is a big issue because we don't really know what's happening in those upland areas. And that's prime amphibian habitat in addition to seeps and springs. And so I can see if we were to hold to just those 3, breaking out something like amphibians very clearly into, we need to look at the effectiveness of the RELZ and ELZ. We need to look at the effectiveness of the buffer within the perennial non-fish bearing, and kind of work our way through where are amphibians and what thing do we need to look at to check to make sure that they're being protected and not degraded. But it seems like it's almost like you got a phrase, and that's your initial list of research topics is the phrases. And then the agenda is really that developing that preliminary research question, including things like breaking it out by. Does that make sense to other people? It was helpful for me at least to be like, oh, that's what the research agenda is.
I am.
Sorry, are you gonna respond to Casey? Because Amanda was next.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Amanda was gonna say something, but.
Oh, go ahead.
If you had something in direct response, it's fine.
It's fine. I was just gonna say, for me, I don't completely have synchronized when the money flows in terms of our budget. So at some point, we're gonna need to do kind of a follow the money conversation, I think, about that as we go down the path you described.
Sure.
That was all.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I have the report open. as I'm looking at it. But I guess I'm just trying to even like orient myself because the questions and the topics all should be focused on the more or less like the covered species and the BGOs associated with the HCP, right? I mean, that's really our charge here. It's not, adaptive management for the sake of adaptive management. It's adaptive management in the context of the habitat conservation plan and the BGOs associated with the covered species. And so, and then in addition to that, the report and the rules outline, that our work should be driven by two primary questions focused on effectiveness monitoring and research inquiry and validation monitoring, which is like kind of some word vomit there.
I was actually on you.
Sorry. But I feel like
Different.
kind of the first two that we have on the list of prioritization are very to me, they're not really effectiveness monitoring. It's like, okay, in addition,
Word vomit.
yeah, they're the second, they're kind of like, okay, well, we didn't quite get here. We need some additional information on these things versus the amphibians to me is more about this like effectiveness monitoring. Like we don't know enough and we need to do more research and figure out if what we're doing makes sense. And even before that, like, what do we even not know? And so I think what I'm getting caught up on a little bit is like the first two are so specific and sort of are in a different class. Then this next one sort of has a different purpose. And to me, it's as we move forward, I feel like our research topics are going to get more broad, similar to the one that's just amphibians, because like Casey outlined, our agenda is going to be where we outline the specifics within that topic of what do we care about and what are our research questions and what do we want to know and what do we want to figure out around that. So I guess, to me, as we move forward, I do think they'll get more broad. And so although I might be getting a little bit caught up in my own brain about kind of the difference between the first two and the third one, I'm getting to a place where I feel more okay about it as I orient myself more about like where we're headed, if that makes sense.
And I just
To give you guys a little bit of my
temperature check on like the first two roads, any side steep slopes, are those feeling like pretty good that we could probably move forward with those? Do those need more discussion? I feel like amphibians and or other items maybe would want to leave to our next meeting for a little more conversation. How are folks feeling comfort wise about or all of the above we
I like that. I think that's,
Okay.
think that's a good breakdown. Yeah.
okay. So generally like feeling okay about roads and east side steep slopes. Okay. Do we feel like want to move forward with a motion? Are we at that level or does that happen at our next meeting at the top? Do folks want to take some time in between? Make a motion. Wendy?
My inclination was because we aren't under any particular pressure to finalize to right now and then some at the next meeting, I'd say kind of on the same place, but why not just wait and do it all together at the next meeting?
The plan the same place. I'm not sure what difference it makes if you do two today and then leave another one. I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm willing to do that, but at some level, it kind of makes sense to have the whole slate.
Julie.
Oh, sorry.
I saw it.
I was just gonna say that my only consideration there is I'm not really sure what the timeline is for the IRSD. And obviously they've got some things to do just to get themselves established. Maybe they don't need something to work on right off the bat, but if they did, and we know that we want to go forward with that, I don't see any reason why they couldn't hand it off to them.
Yeah, I think our deadline is just that August one, so we have a little bit of buffer, but
David.
oh, sorry.
Sure. I think just briefly, it would be helpful for me if someone like Terry's group or whoever could just come up with a list of asking a question is very important in the beginning of anything. So maybe it would behoove us to have a list, it's a set of questions, these first two topics are pretty simple compared to the third one. But I mean, this part of my career was studying landslides. And so, you know, you can go down a rabbit hole pretty easy.
Yeah.
And so it'd be nice to know upfront what are the questions? What were people thinking about? And so at least that way it would help me contribute to this conversations.
You're saying more background as to how these became topic?
Yeah, or like, you know, like each slide, you talk about literature review, a literature review of what? I mean, what aspect of the roads are you talking about, or the slopes are you talking about? You know, and so that would just help me, yeah.
And just to clarify, that's where we can, over the next several months into the fall, we can bring in a set of experts on these general, you know, research topics. So they could say, here's the challenges we're seeing with harvest, or here's the challenges that could exist with harvest on steep slopes in Eastern Oregon. And so you could ask question A about, you know, how that impacts habitat. So there's that refining of to a research question that's still coming up. That's not the stage you're at today. And so that's where we can, after you've made your initial list of topics, research topics, we can get there. We can get to those. That the next step will be, here's a research question. Because if you hand over literature review to Eastern Oregon steep slopes to the IRST, they're going to say, oh, okay, what do we think is important? Which is you know, your purview is to decide what are the important research topics in an informed way by having those conversations with experts. So this sort of leads into I'm just going to raise the question of at the next meeting, David, could you take this down so we can see each other a little bit easier?
Sure. Yeah.
At the next meeting, I think the question is, we were thinking of doing a field trip, but if there's still substantial conversation about what are the initial list of research topics, and then how do you want to proceed in narrowing those down for August? So I'll just throw that back to Stacy and Seth to see if you want to add to that thought.
So I would say, just so you're all aware, what we had planned is to have this field trip actually inform some of the discussion today. We were going to do it around roads because we anticipated roads would be at least one of the first topics, and what would we monitor? So some of what Adrian was alluding to, you know, like sort of brainstorming, what additional could you put in addition to the disconnect? What are some other things that people think? And so both as an educational opportunity to educate the committee on what the PFA is for roads. And so we were going to have ODF's Greg Erb, the engineer, who was the center person for the road rules themselves with ODF, come and talk about some of the bigger pieces of that. And then start to talk about as a group, just brainstorm a little bit. What are some things people think should be monitored with roads? And that could lead into a discussion on this topic. So, but if I may, Dave, one of what you're getting into sort of even for the east slopes is sort of speaks to, I think, some of the reasons why we might not want to bite off more than we can chew with these initial list of topics. Because there are, even with that slopes question, it looks like a narrow question. But when you start diving into it, there are different ways you could go with that question, or you could go with a couple of different questions within that. But no, and I totally agree with you. And so again, it sort of lends itself to the idea that maybe you know, being judicious on the buckets that we put up there first, so we have time to digest and get into the specifics. And that's, some of this will come out as you do the literature review. Maybe you start the literature review first and you inform the literature review with 2 questions. And that then informs what your research question will be on the backside, if there is a need for research on the other side of that. So all to say, I think this has all been a really good discussion, but if we want to do that field trip next week, I just wanted you all to know that was kind of Stacy and I and Terry's idea, was that it would dovetail with this conversation and take a piece of what we're talking about here today and get a little bit deeper into it, serving a couple of different purposes. One would be informing the discussion and the other one would be just getting a chance to know each other a little bit better outside of this room. Which I think could be useful too.
And if I can too, just quickly, Josh, because I know we're kind of at the end of time here. I think just to clarify the question before us, there's 3 that we're required to do. And then I think the question we need to answer at the next meeting is there anything else missing right now in this initial slate? Or do we feel comfortable moving forward with those 3? I think we've outlined a lot of the complexity. You know, we don't have to worry about the research questions right now, but we do know that a lot of things could fit within those 3 buckets. So do we feel comfortable with those 3 that we are required to do, or is there something else that's missing? And so I guess that's just the question that I would pose to the group to think about and be prepared to make a decision on at our next meeting. Does that make sense to folks? Sorry, Josh.
No, that's all right. So, yeah, so I appreciate Amanda a lot looking at stuff. And so I guess the efficacy piece is what I'm always going to focus on. And so with the in streams and the west side LPAs, I'm thinking efficacy for amphibians and also efficacy for the covered fish. Just to kind of clarify where I was coming from. Something we're gonna have to do, because I really appreciate Seth's concern about not biting off more than 2, but regardless of whether we have 3 topics or 18 as our initial research topics, which I'm not advocating for 18. I would say, 4 or 5. That's just me. But we're gonna have to prioritize and we're gonna have to put them in an order and we're gonna have to argue respectfully over what that order looks like. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there to get a little bit to your process question is that when we are coming forward with a motion and discussion around it, I think we will want to include in that what our priority order is. Like, for example, do we just want to knock out the east side thing and the road monitoring design and then dive into what are the habitat needs of amphibians and what's the efficacy of the rule set for fish and amphibians or something like that. But we're going to need to put it in some kind of order, given that we don't have infinite money and staff. And that's my last thought.
And I just want to be conscious of time, but to follow up on Josh's, forgive me for not having it all in order, but to the question of how we prioritize, at least by rule, we actually, the initial list of priorities, the initial research questions is research topics. I want to get this right. Sorry, research topics is different than prioritizing, and it's different than having enough information from a literature review, because we get the literature review by sending research questions to the IRST. They develop a literature review. It allows us to develop an agenda, a research agenda that includes prioritization based upon money and time and value and all that. So I apologize if I led you astray, but hopefully that helps with figuring out which thing we're being asked to do now versus the thing we'll be asked to do later. It helps me at least be like, oh, okay.
Any other thoughts? Anyone online? Jason, questions before we wrap here?
No, I don't have any other.
This, I could really use a glossary where we're specific about how we define a research agenda versus a research topic versus I think I know what a question is, but the other two, like, I'm not sure where one ends and the other begins.
And maybe research order order of those things would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be really helpful to me.
Yeah, just a process question as we wrap up here today. So I guess where we're leaving it today, it doesn't sound like we're gonna do a field trip for the next meeting.
Well, that's kind of what I was asking. What do you guys want to do? I mean, the way we had set it up, Terry, we had like a couple hours of meeting time at a district office and then a couple hours in the field. So, and this was originally what we set up was this is the topic of discussion. So we actually did not think initially that we would get a decision here. We initially thought that would happen at that. This was just to introduce, but Terry at the last sort of minute said, hey, we might actually make a decision, so we should notice that. So we did. So don't feel like you guys are behind the eight ball because we
Yeah.
actually didn't plan on making the decision today.
We've also got July, correct? And we have to have it adopted by August 1st, so that gives us June and eventually the July meeting to finish things up.
Yeah.
I think
And
we
is that adopted by the board or? I can't remember.
That's a Terry question. I think it's
MC
just by law.
decision.
Okay. Okay, so I guess I'm just, maybe this is for you guys to decide kind of in your co-chairs and Terry meetings. But I guess where do we need to get at the next meeting to feel comfortable moving forward? Because we do have a deadline to meet. And so, you know, like I said earlier, I mean, you know, this is what is in rule. So I'm comfortable if that's all that the negotiators that, you know, this big group came together and that's what they decided. I mean, I feel like we just move forward, but I understand that, you know, just the word amphibians is pretty broad as well. So I'm just kind of wanting to take a temperature check from the group of like, where do we need to get next month in order to be able to move forward?
I mean, I think, you know, based on the requirements, those three are sort of on our agenda already. I think the question is, and if those can come prepared to the next meeting, like, is there anything else that we're missing? Like, what else should be on that list? And that's what I would love that conversation to really look like. Sorry, Casey, and then Jason.
I think Jason,
Jason.
and he also has.
Great, and I just wanted to circle back because what I thought I heard was we were pretty much right where we needed to be on roads and steep slopes. Did I not hear that correctly? Like those two, we're just saying, let's delay those. We might as well make one decision. And so I don't think we're that far off. So coming back to the question of the field trip, I think the question is then, can the field trip help inform those and further inform the amphibian discussion, which would help us maybe get across the finish line?
I think. the
I'm
field
happy
trip
to,
help
I'm
you.
happy to respond. Oh, Terry's gonna say something. I would happy to respond to that, Jason, which is that I think it might be useful if we have a question that's around whether we want amphibians to be a research topic. I'm gonna get the language right. Then maybe the field trip, it would be useful to have at least some component of it is talking about amphibians. I don't know if you can do that. Your magic. But to clarify, then they would be, but hopefully by the end of the next meeting, we would be able to vote on an initial list of research topics, getting the language right.
Well, and maybe, sorry, I feel like, so the amphibians are sort of on the list as directed by statute. So it's not so much on or off, and we don't have to define questions of what fits in there yet. This is really just those big buckets of east side steep slopes, amphibians, roads, which we are required to do. Is there something else that's missing, or do we feel comfortable moving forward with those three? And then we'll have time, and I think we just sketched out, this deadline isn't required by statute, but you know, we were talking about maybe research questions like in the fall. So we really have through the summer, and that's where kind of the idea of maybe doing some focused field trip meetings, like one on roads, one on amphibians, one on steep slopes, potentially bring in experts to help define that. Just as a rough process. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and I could not agree more, Stacy. The question about amphibians, it's a big one. You guys have all highlighted it, which is absolutely, you're spot on. And unfortunately, I don't think we're gonna be able to solve that by a 2-hour field trip. But we can certainly put it as a topic, and I think it needs to be moving forward for how do we own the questions. Work with what the IRST is going to be seated after June. Hopefully all that goes on well and they get officially put in place, and then they start becoming involved in the conversation as well, and they can sort of help us weigh in some of that. And it looks like Jason's got his hand
Oh,
up.
Jason.
Great. And I just another plug, I guess, for the field trip regardless is it does get you in a different creative space for having these conversations. So, if it's a possibility, I'm definitely in favor of that.
Maybe shove thumbs on field trip for next meeting.
Just one quick question, I guess. So then would the field trip come first and then we'd have an in-office? Because, I mean, it sounds like that's sort of what people said was that they want the field trip to inform the conversation on how we move forward on the topic. So I guess I'm just trying to, and then I guess beyond that, I thought that the consternation was around the fact that that third one was just amphibians and that was it. And we couldn't vote because it just said amphibians. And so, but now I'm hearing you, Stacy, say, well, that's it. So I'm a little bit confused where we're at in the process, because if those three are set and that's it, then the next meeting is to vote on whether or not there should be more. It doesn't seem like that's actually where we left it. It seemed like there was more conversation that needed to occur around whether or not the topic is amphibians or the topic is something about amphibians. Does that make, I guess that's why I'm a little bit confused. And I know we're at time, so I'm not trying to
Well, that's a good clarification, because I was sort of like, these are the ones that are required, the language is in statute, we sort of move forward and then use our following time to better define what is in that bucket. That bucket is sort of what we know and what we move forward with, so there's less of a decision to be made there, but I understand, I hear that.
I just want to make sure that I heard kind of the group correctly, because now I'm unsure.
I think you heard me. I'm a splitter, so amphibians, I think, what are the habitat needs questions? What's the efficacy of the BMPs? Question, I want to break amphibians down a bit. I don't know if anyone else actually felt that way.
So just to keep in mind, that the distinction between a research topic which is broad, it's meant to be gargantuan, it's meant to be very broad. And then over the next 3 to 5, 6 months, you break that big bucket down and say, this is our really important research question that we're going to dive into. And so the field trip will get you there. Right now, we're focusing on roads. It'll get you partway there to going, oh, this is our research question. It's fill in the blank, looking at fish passage, looking at hydrologic disconnection. So that's where, and I apologize that we didn't make a better distinction from the beginning between research topics and research questions, because you're right, the research question, what question you ask is crucial. But at this stage of the game, what's the big bucket? And so to reiterate what Stacy was saying, we've got these 3 buckets. Are we going to add another bucket at this stage of the game?
The other thing we need to talk about at some point is the process for adjusting or amending or adding a priority list, because we do need a process for that.
Yeah.
It's not like we're going to set something in stone forever here.
Correct.
There will be opportunities to add things for sure.
So I think you've hit on it pretty well, but I am concerned that when you talk about adding another big topic, if it's a word like amphibians, where it's a single word, and I'm not sure if we're only talking about, so I don't have the research and don't have the history of what the discussion was that hung up the committee as they argued through the late nights about amphibians. But if the topic is as big as amphibians is for me, I'm very concerned, as well as with budget and time, that a topic as big as amphibians, we could come up with 100 questions out of that. And I'm worried about that some. And so that's one. Second, if someone has a burning topic, I'd love to see it submitted sooner than later, so we can start reading and thinking about the topic. I've not done, and maybe I should start, but maybe I was hoping the IST would in fact deliver some research for me to read to help me understand amphibians or pieces. But that's the part that's missing for me, is that if the topics for me are already picked, the first 3. And I don't know if we need to do a motion to say that they picked them and we accept them, then that's maybe a great motion to make and get done. But what does that mean for questions is I'm stuck with, especially on amphibians and whatever else big topic might come, I'm stuck with not knowing enough to even ask the right question.
And apologies if that wasn't more clear at the beginning, but that's totally great. I don't think any of us are on quite at that level where we can develop those questions. The decision before us is really just moving forward with those 3 that are required in statute. And are we missing something else big? I think there's a lot of reasons, budget capacity, that we should stick with those 3, but that was just the goal for this discussion. And I know that we are after time, and I so apologize. So I'll make sure Adam and Julie, and then we probably need to wrap up here.
Yeah, and I agree with William. I think the sooner we can get better handle of the state of the science on amphibians, the better. I don't know if there's any amphibian experts here. There may not have been amphibian experts in the negotiation, which may be why they didn't reach a certain point where they wanted to reach. So I think that would be helpful as maybe even more so than a field trip. If we can get some experts in the room, but I realize that that's not always easy, so.
Yeah, no, I think that would be the goal as we're developing those research questions, which happens over the summer and into the fall. We can bring in those experts. If a field trip makes sense, we do that. If it's a dialogue, if we bring in IRST. The other, Terry, any final thoughts?
Yeah, lots of great discussion. And I think really right now the question is, are we going to try and collectively going to try and do a field trip knowing that it's going to eat, do we want to have a longer meeting because a field trip, just the transportation between a district office and then a nearby site is 20 minutes minimum, probably more like 30. And so then, that's an hour-ish of your time. And then, and then want at least a couple hours in the field. And then if you also want a couple hours in a district office, for example, to have the conversation, that's 5 hours right there. So that's a, how do you feel about setting aside 5 hours and squeezing the focusing the conversation and having the field trip?
I think it's worth it personally.
I think over the long term, it's going to be very helpful. Or even over the medium term.
They run a bus, we can conduct some of the meetings, and I've done that.
Except that it has to be public.
That's good.
TV, radio. Yeah, I guess if we allowed opportunity for public to come, I mean, the odds are we're gonna get Amanda probably. We should keep them into the bus.
I mean, Megan.
But, or Megan, that's
I was like.
the other. Just kidding. I would suggest also that we include our lunchtime in that, right? So we could probably just get a sack lunch and use that as our drive time or whatever.
I think it'd be helpful since the next thing to do is to start working on those preliminary research questions.
Okay, so field trip and then some business time where we'll make a vote and substantial decision on our research agenda.
Do you want to set any sort of deadline for if we had additional research topics to consider? If the whole point is that we're trying to decide if there's more, I would like to know if people have ideas prior to showing up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
if you guys can work with Terry on what that deadline looks like and get that to us, I think that'd be helpful to be able to have some thoughts.
Thinking of a field trip, you could blend the roads with the amphibians pretty easily, because you could find a place that has a ditch. Where amphibians lay their eggs and they spend part of their early life cycle, and find an upland where they spend the rest part of their life, that way it gives people appreciation that they live in two different spots. And I think you need, like everybody's saying, you need to see this stuff.
Yeah, I think all that discussion will happen, whether we specifically plan for it or not, because we'll be out there on the site, looking at rocks and looking at strength.
all right, field trip and decision on our research topics next meeting. Thank you all for staying a little after. Apologies for that. But really appreciate the discussion. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
If anybody
Thanks,
didn't
everyone.
sign the attendance.
I didn't do that.
Oh, man. Good job, Brown, if you didn't get that.
See you next time in person.